Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third workshop in the conversation informing the Southwestern Public Service Company's 2026 Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP. This is Margie Tatro. I'm joined by my colleagues Kathy Boyce and Deborah Shields from GridWorks as your facilitator for today's workshop. It's April the 30th, 2026, and this workshop is being recorded so that folks can listen to it after the fact, or we can share it with people who haven't been able to be here. So hopefully you can hear and see the slide deck. We'll go through a few details and then we'll get started with a very good conversation about modeling. Today we're focusing on modeling foundation, how the utility uses modeling to inform their plans for the future. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. You can see on the next slide, our objectives are really to, first of all, respond to follow-up issues that were raised at the prior workshop, and then build our collective knowledge about the modeling framework, plans, inputs, assumptions, and the importance of modeling in creating the details for the IRP, or the Integrated Resource Plan. This is also important to prepare stakeholders to receive model results in future workshops. So understanding modeling will help everyone understand the base case model results that the utility will be presenting and additional model results if necessary. So this is an important foundation. Our agenda today after the workshop, we'll spend the majority of time hearing from the experts at the Southwestern Public Service about modeling, and we'll have several question and answer segments built into that segment of our workshop today. We'll summarize at 11:50 and then adjourn by noon. So again, thank you all for being here. Your input, your conversation, your interest is very important and helpful. We appreciate everyone who is here. A couple of reminders for our workshop today. Please, during the presentations, we'd like to ask you to hold your questions until our designated Q&A segments. At that time, we'll ask you to raise your hand, and Kathy and I will call upon you to ask you to state your question. Please remember to give your name and your organization when you are starting your question or comment. We're going to ask that you speak clearly and project your voice. In particular, our participants who are joined together in a conference room there in Albuquerque. This is very important, especially for you all, so that the microphones pick up your question for all to hear. Please continue to be respectful in your comments and recognize that we're all working with good intentions. So please continue to give each other the benefit of the doubt. Share your ideas, leave time for others. And really important today, please, the participants gathered in Albuquerque, if you would refrain from any side conversations or take those conversations into the hallway, we'd greatly appreciate it. Our technology in the room is intended to pick up all conversations, and so we're hoping that we don't confuse the OWL technology microphone by focusing on those who are stating their question or the presenter. So I know it's tempting sometimes to follow up on a question with your neighbor, but please refrain from doing that. Thank you for your understanding. Just to remind everyone, our work together is guided by this key question: what is SPS's resource need to meet the expected demand while satisfying all the requirements that the utility has for managing the system? You'll see on this graphic the three areas where stakeholder input is specifically provided for in the New Mexico IRP rule. And we've talked about this before, so just want to refresh you on that. And the next slide you've also seen, it's just a reminder about who's engaged in this process, the different organizations and their roles. Really, we're all here to have a collective conversation to advise the public utility on their IRP, and specifically, we're hoping to reach potential agreement in the utility's development of its Statement of Need and Action Plan. The next slide reviews our process. Where are we in the schedule? Here is the timeline and theme for the upcoming, well, for all of our workshops. We are today in workshop number 3, and we're focusing on the modeling foundation. And we'll also have the SPS team will discuss, as they mentioned in the last workshop, their process for offering access to modeling information through some forms that you'll hear more about at the end of today's workshop. I wanted to point out that after today's workshop, we will start to dive even deeper into detailed modeling conversations. All stakeholders are invited to participate in this May through July timeframe. The 3 workshops will focus on detailed modeling. If that is not your preferred set of topics or not your cup of tea, we welcome you to come back around workshop 7, where you'll hear the results and analysis and decisions that are being put forward as a result of all the modeling. But if you're not interested in the details of May through July, we will welcome you back for the big picture conversation starting in August. But wanted to let you know that we still are planning these 8 workshops. We will dive deep into modeling May through July and invite anybody back for the big picture results and conclusions starting in August. I'd also like to mention that we are planning to do hybrid workshops, so that's opportunities for in-person and virtual in June and August, most likely in the southeastern part of the state of New Mexico in SPS's service territory. So wanted to make those announcements. With that, let me ask Kathy, is there anything else we needed to add before we turn the podium over to SPS?
No, I think we're all clear. Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
Are there any questions about process or any of the material that we've just described? Let's give a pause in case there are questions about where we are and where we're headed with this timeline slide up. Any questions? All right, well, welcome again. And at this point, we'll take down our slide deck, turn it over to the SPS team, who is mostly assembled in the conference room there in Albuquerque. So we'll turn it over to you, Linda, and I think Jared perhaps is the first speaker. So please go ahead. Again, folks, please hold your questions. We will have question and answer segments built in and in 3 different places in the presentation this morning. So please hold your questions, jot down a note if you'd like to come back to it, and then we'll ask at various segments for you to raise your hand, come off mute, enable your camera, and ask your question in person. So with that, Linda, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, can you hear us?
Yes, we can. I can hear
Okay.
you. I don't yet see Jared.
Good morning. Sitting here in the room, are you able to see our presentation, Margie?
No.
No, we can share remotely if you need that. Or Linda, I guess our understanding was you were going to drive.
Yep, just give us a moment.
Okay.
Do that here.
And then share button over there. Jason.
Okay, I think it took this time.
Yes, it is. It is up. And can you do a full screen display by chance, Linda? If not, this will still work.
Yeah, whenever I did full screen, it's not working right on the screen in here. It's cutting it off. So
Great.
if this
Okay.
is okay, we'll leave it.
Well, we'll follow along. And Deb, if you wouldn't mind putting into chat the link to the GridWorks website where people can find these presentations and all the material from today in case people wanted to follow along with a larger screen. So Deb will put that into chat. You'll find this presentation as well as the other materials. And so please go ahead, Jared. Thank you.
All right, well, good morning. Thank you. We have a full deck today with a number of really critical topics we really want to get into. I'm just going to give a brief overview of today's presentation. We'll be jumping in and out with different speakers today. As Margie highlighted, today is really a lot about modeling, but we also have some topics we want to get into about forecasting, advanced technologies, Southwest Power Pool, as well as addressing some of the open questions that have come up in the prior stakeholder meetings. And so I guess I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Jared Cooley, Senior Director of Strategic Planning for SPS. Today we'll have a number of speakers. We'll have Justin Gable, our Director of Resource Planning and Bidding. We'll have Dr. John Goodenough, our Director of Energy and Demand Forecasting. We'll have Dr. Taylor Moo, who will cover us in our advanced technology discussion. And then we'll circle back to myself to talk over Southwest Power Pool activities later on in the presentation. We posted the deck in advance. Hopefully, individuals who are following along today were able to look through that. We do call out a number of slides throughout the deck that we want to have engagement, because these are some of the critical inputs that we want from the stakeholders to help drive what we're putting together. As Margie said, as we're working through this process, through the modeling, and then the analysis, and then where we're getting to at the end of the statement of needs. So we have some topics we definitely would like to solicit feedback from stakeholders today, get your thoughts and considerations, what's important, and we'll work through that. So we'll take opportunities throughout the deck. Those slides that we're really kind of highlighting have kind of a star or a sunburst in the upper right corner that kind of highlight that. It even says we're looking for feedback. So if you didn't catch those on your first time through, hopefully you'll see that as we walk through the deck today. Again, we're just gonna take a little bit right off the bat to talk about the open items from prior workshops. This has topics from resource planning, talks about load forecasting. There's some questions about Southwest Power Pool, and then some kind of general miscellaneous ones. I'm just going to turn it over to Mr. Gable, to kind of talk about some of our responses to some of the resource planning questions that are right off the bat in the deck. So, good morning, Justin.
Thanks, Jared. Yes, Justin Gable, Director of Resource Planning. Glad to be here. Just to go through some of the open questions, and we're not going to go through every one of them. We have provided answers to all these questions in the appendices, but a lot of this presentation material is directly related to these questions. So as you're looking through the slides, and as we're talking about things, these questions will kind of come up. I do have a couple of questions that I highlighted that I just wanted to just roll through real quickly. The first question, how is SPS considering emerging technologies? We do have an entire section in this presentation directed towards the emerging technologies, and the SPSs and Excel Energy as a larger group sees these different long duration storage and the feasibility of those, and also what the time frame is. So really the presentation that Dr. Moot will be going over with us today. A couple of other questions I thought were kind of important that weren't necessarily highlighted explicitly in the deck were questions 4, which talks about the 24 and 25 RFPs. So the 25 RFP is an active solicitation right now, so there's not, we have to limit what we can talk about on specifics there. But in general, how will the CCN approvals impact resource planning? And they could drastically affect it. So in all of our IRP model that you're considering right now, all of the RFP, or all the resources from the 24 RFP are considered as existing in this IRP modeling exercise. Now the 25 RFP, that's an active solicitation. Bids are not firm there, so we are kind of just moving those to the side right now. So it's not going to be considered in the IRP. It will have an effect ultimately moving forward on resource planning as a whole. Will these bring more batteries on the system? 24 RFP, we were seeking approval over or right around 1 gigawatt of batteries. So yes, the 24 RFP is bringing more batteries to the SPS system. And the idea of an SPS split system, there's some conversation on some of our modeling scenarios that we'll talk about later on. That is one of the scenarios that we're specifically looking at. To go to the next slide, just to real quickly, regarding the 24 RFP, did removing thermal resources mean the selection that includes more batteries? This is something that we did look at, is if the thermal generation that was not move forward in the 24 IRP, what would that look like? And yes, it did bring additional batteries to the system through 2045. If you would like more information on some of these questions as well, especially this one, please see us in the office hours. We're more than happy to discuss this some more. Explain the differences between the IRP generic resources and RFP specific resources. And will you run a scenario that removes thermal resources? The answer to that last question is yes. The first part of the question was the difference between generic resources and bids or specific resources. Generic, these are inside the IRP model. Those just represent the general technology, and they can be incrementally increased to fit the exact need of the system. So the generic resources are a kind of a blue sky approach to looking at what the system needs are. The RFP specific resources represent actual bids. So the actual ability for specific bids to look exactly like generic resources is almost certainly not possible. We can get close. The idea is that you want the RFP resources would look as close to what the generic results would be. But ultimately, you were limited to what is physically available on the market at the time of the bids. So, and the last one, just talking about prior IRP modeling, I would just say that there have been a lot of changes since the last IRP, and I would not necessarily look at a previous IRP and copy and paste that onto our current IRP process. A number of things have happened. Particularly looking at PTC, tax credits, and where those are going in the market, thermal generation, pricing for those things. Load growth is seeming to outpace what our expectations were for the 23 IRP. There's a number of changes, so I would not necessarily assume that previous IRP results can project future IRP results. So, I'll just get back over to you, Jared. Is John on the call? Is he want to talk anything specific about some of the load forecasting questions?
I am here. Hopefully folks can hear me. John Goodenough, Director of Sales Energy and Demand Forecasting. Looking at some of the open questions for load forecasting, I do touch on a lot of this in kind of a few slides when we're going through the load forecasting section. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. As we'll discuss, the underlying drivers are expansion of oil and gas, electrification of oil and gas, and data center loads are really the key drivers of the load growth, at least in the near term. There's a little bit of EV growth a little bit further out in the forecast that I have some information on. As far as cost allocation, I don't really discuss that in the load forecasting section. I think that's probably separate from the IRP process in general, but obviously an important topic and something the company, does need to address and does plan on addressing. I do talk about oil and gas growth and the data center growth in more detail in a couple slides. So not really gonna discuss those questions. As far as how much data center growth, and maybe going back to the first question, what is some of the criteria to include the new requests in our forecast? So the requests that are included in the forecast are kind of in two buckets. It's discrete requests, like load requests that we can trace through and show how that transforms into load, actual load in the forecast, and then our probabilistic modeling. So for the discrete projects, those are pretty firm. They're requests or customers that have signed ESAs. There's strong indication of the need over the next couple of years, or they've been delayed due to SPP study reasons, but we're confident once those reasons are overcome that they will progress to an ESA and connect into the forecast. That's part of the reason, as we look at this number 5 here, that kind of to me addresses our probabilistic modeling. We need to plan for more than just what's currently contracted or currently high probability, and that's where we get into this probabilistic modeling, accounting for more growth both in oil and gas and data centers beyond our near-term knowledge of specific customer requests as we go out into the forecast. For the next one, I'll provide additional detail here in a couple slides. I'm hopeful we have some economic development team representatives on the call to maybe answer some more specific questions about specific industries or specific operations. And we'll see in a slide or two, we do have the unconstrained forecast, which highlights the current customer demand that we cannot meet because of the system constraints, and how that would increase or potentially increase the near-term forecast over what we're showing in our IRP forecast.
Thanks, John. So kind of just kind of covering what Justin Gable and John Goodman have shared is that a lot of the topics we're hoping to hit in the presentation today. We also have the material, the appendice. Again, we do have the office hours that we're going to post if additional questions are needed. So the whole goal here is to try to be transparent and answer questions as much as possible. This section is about transmission planning and about Southwest Power Pool. And so I'll provide a verbal answer to these. And again, these are topics that we can further discuss as necessary down the road. 765 kV additions. This is a very big topic within the Southwest Power Pool and very sensitive to SPS in particular. Currently, we have been assigned 2 765 kV transmission lines from the Southwest Power Pool out of their integrated transmission planning study processes. The first one is called Potter to Crossroads of Phantom. It runs from Amarillo down into southeast New Mexico. And the second one is called Crawfish Draw to Phantom. So same endpoint down in southeast New Mexico, where we're seeing a significant amount of growth. But this one is coming from more of the Lubbock, Texas area. Now, what are the impacts on SPS's system constraints? So both those transmission lines will really help alleviate some of the congestion that we see between kind of the overall SPS and into southeast New Mexico. We have what is currently called a flow gate called the SPS New Mexico ties. And so adding more transmission that connects on the north side of that to the south side of that will help allow more transfer of energy across that interface, hopefully to help alleviate some of that. But transmission facilities alone are not the only solution to addressing some of those flow gates. Having generation built more in the southern section of our footprint also helps alleviate some of those concerns. And so that's kind of one of the key flow gates, but we also have other system constraints. We have a very critical one that's between SPS and the rest of the Southwest Power Pool. And so that is how much energy we can actually import into our footprint and then maybe ship that energy south or where to the load as necessary. That constraint is still under development. The Southwest Power Pool has identified additional 765 kV lines between Crawfish Draw and Potter into the Oklahoma area. So we'll see how that kind of gets facilitated out of the 2026 ITP, which will not be finalized until later this year. But we do expect to see possibly more transmission identified to alleviate those concerns. We've historically seen a lot of those concerns in the generation interconnection processes, and that has actually been one of the key drivers for the honestly generation dropping out within our footprint as part of the generation interconnection queue is the exporting of that energy to the rest of the Southwest Power Pool, the needing of large transmission, and those high costs being direct assigned. And so I talked about at the second workshop, we talked about the consolidated planning process, and that should hopefully help facilitate addressing some of those constraints in the future as well. So there's a lot of movement on our system constraints. More transmission, more generation will alleviate some of those, but it'll also possibly change those depending on where the growth and where the generation transmission are at. Are we taking questions now?
No.
Okay, questions. The second question is really about the Southwest Power Pool. And so that one is, there's a lot of concerns that have been brought up about the plan reserve margin requirements, as well as the way that the Southwest Power Pool calculates your accreditation for resources. So just one thing really to highlight there is that ELCC, the effective load carrying capabilities, as well as performance-based accreditation, at least for thermal resources, that those methodologies are collectively identified and figured out with all the members of the Southwest Power Pool, and then ultimately filed at FERC. So these were policies, processes that were debated widely across all stakeholders, whether you're a co-op, municipal, independent power producer, whether you are huge into thermal assets, whether you're a renewable advocate, this is where it eventually came out to collectively across the region. And then FERC approved these methodologies moving forward. And so there are opportunities if need be to continue to edit and refine down the road, but that will involve continued engagement with the stakeholders, the right size. And that is one of the key parts of being within an RTO is the regional perspective and trying to find the right fit for everybody versus what always benefits individual areas. And so there's pros and cons, there's trade-offs there. When we think about the cost to customers, I think that really comes into our RFPs, right? Our RFPs are all source RFPs, and finding that right balance of resources, not only how are they accredited today, but then into the future. And so finding those balances, making assumptions, identifying, what will be the best levers to serve our customers at an 8760 level. Have we considered withdrawing from the RTO? This is a topic that gets brought up. There are, within the Southwest Power Pool tariff, there are provisions to withdrawing. Although those withdrawal provisions have a very steep price tag associated with those. And that is definitely something that we'll be bringing back to the stakeholders. We are required to bring back an analysis on our participation in the Southwest Power Pool in 2028. We're investigating, is that something we need to speed up? But the concept of withdrawing, because of how the Southwest Power Pool does cost allocation, if we withdraw from the Southwest Power Pool, we'll be required to pay for the transmission that we're going to be paying for, our customers are going to be paying for, and making the other utilities whole in the Southwest Power Pool. So currently we have around 11 to 12% is what our load ratio share is of the entire region. So if we withdraw, there's also the projects in our footprint that others are paying for, but we'd also have to pay for others or for the projects that are in other people's service territories. And so it's a very complicated metric and something we can dig into deeper into the future. And we also talk later in the presentation, we do talk about some of the costs and benefits of being part of the Southwest Power Pool. So I want to highlight the positives. And we'll talk about some of the impacts of exiting in the future. And then just the last one is transmission constraints. How does Southeast New Mexico compare to the rest of the system? That is where we're seeing significant amount of growth that wants to happen today. We are seeing data center activity in other parts of our areas within the SPS footprint. But what we know is we have a very specific load pocket in New Mexico. As I talked about before, we already have some flow gates that govern how much energy we can put into Southeast New Mexico. And then more transmission is being developed. We've also had some generation out of the 2024 RFP, Gaines County in particular, which is on the south side of that interface. That should help facilitate some of those congestion issues. But to address, we do expect to see this continuing to be an up and down constraint, because as we add generation, it also allows us to unlock load. And so it's going to be a constant back and forth until we get to a more stable position of robust transmission and robust generation into that area. And then just on the last one, we have open questions related to miscellaneous topics. And so again, wildcat power purchase agreements, hydrogen, methane reduction accounted for in our transportation plan. We have written responses to these within the document, so we need to circle back on these in a future date. Please, let's dive in a little bit deeper. We took our first stab at answering these questions with the understanding that more questions could be raised in the future. So with that, let's turn it over to some of the meat of our presentation today. Load forecasting with Dr. Goodenough.
All right, thanks, Jared. Hello again, everybody. So I spent a decent amount of time in the prior workshop, kind of laying the foundation for the trends that we've been seeing historically in growth and some of the methodologies we use to do our forecasting. I can certainly answer questions on that during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. But what I really want to focus on here is the forecast of what the key drivers of growth are in the forecast that we've actually developed. The one thing I'll note is you'll see that the 26 IRP forecast, both the planning and on this graph, the unconstrained planning, are marked preliminary. We're just going through our final reviews. I don't anticipate changes, certainly not any large changes to what we see here, but just for awareness, they're not completely finalized within SPS yet. One of the things that we'd indicated when we presented last time, we talked through our revised methodology for the 2025 V2 planning forecast, which is the black dashed line on the graph that you see. And we kind of said we expect to see similar results when we run our 26 IRP models, and we did. So that's in line with our expectations. You can see pretty rapid growth, certainly in the near term, when we have clear insight into specific customer requests for the next 8 to 9 years, maybe the next decade or so. And then the growth starts to tail off a little bit when it's just driven by the probability distributions. The gray line on here is the unconstrained planning forecast that I mentioned earlier. So if we were to take all of the requests that we have right now that are deemed highly likely based on the criteria that we use, and put them into the forecast at their requested ramps, ignoring the constraints in serving that load, that's what you would get. So you can see much sharper growth in the near term, a lot of demand in the near term that we're essentially having to bring on in phases as the system constraints get relieved, and that's what you see in the red line. One other thing to note here, we have the red dotted line, which is our 26 V1 financial forecast. So it's the more conservative version of the red solid line. And you can see that that's starting to creep up toward prior IRP or planning forecasts, which is what you expect to see over time. As the loads become even more certain and are included into a financial outlook, you see that that more conservative forecast starts to approach prior planning forecasts, which include a little bit more load. Interesting chart interesting charts and an interesting dynamic. What I'm showing here is essentially a stack of what is driving, the components of the load at the peak hour as we go through time. And the reason I say there's an interesting dynamic here is that you see that the season of the peak switches kind of out around 2040, and I'll get to the driver of that here in a second. But we've got the solid blue section here is what I would call kind of historical, typical utility growth. You've got, customer growth offset by energy efficiency, offset by DG, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of what the industry has seen for forever. And then you can see the trend there. And then what we're stacking on top of that is our expectation for EVs and EV load, our expectation for large loads, namely data centers and oil and gas, electrification and expansion. As we go through time, data centers are more than half of the large load additions through 2030 when we have very specific near-term customers that we're adding. Beyond that, oil and gas is the main driver of growth. I mentioned the system becoming winter peaking. So if we look at the graph or the chart on the top, you can see right around 2040, the orange section or the EV section kind of gets a lot larger, and the retail XEV and X large loads gets a lot smaller. That's a function of shifting to a winter peaking hour. The black dotted line on this graph is the summer peak for those years. So you can see the load starts to exceed that summer peak as we get to winter peaking, driven by EV adoption and our assumed pattern of EV charging. You see it's a winter peak and it's an overnight peak when we assume a lot of those EVs will be charging. So just an interesting result from the modeling. If you zoom in and you look at just a typical summer peak hour, which is the bottom chart, again, the dotted line is the actual peak forecast. So that is the peak until we switch to winter peaking. The EV contribution just kind of steadily grows over time as you get more EV adoption. So it really is the assumed charging patterns of the EVs that are driving us to winter peaking in 2040. You can see we have this flagged as a topic for potential future discussion. Certainly happy to provide a little more detail today or do a deeper dive on this during office hours if folks are interested. Next slide. So this is just a zoom in at 2045, and it's just maybe an easier way to see the impact of the the EV load on the seasonal peak. So you've got a stack, the same stack. So retail, oil and gas, data centers, and EVs. Looking at the summer day, a typical summer peak, so a summer afternoon peak. The summer peak itself moves to 9 p.m. due to EV load, and again, the annual peak moves to the winter hour ending 2 a.m. due to EV load. So you can see that the stack is bigger in the winter, but the retail component is smaller, which is what you saw on the prior graph. Talked a bit about the probability distributions earlier. So in the very near term, and you can see for the first couple of years, we're not including any load associated with probability distributions. So those are all loads that we can tie back to specific requests. What we expect to see, though, is over time, both existing requests now that haven't quite met those criteria start to meet that criteria. So we start to see more load that we would include in the forecast, or just requests that we haven't even seen yet start to come in. So this is a 20-year forecast, and we have good insight into the next maybe 5 to 7 years based on specific customer information. So that's where the probability distribution comes in. It's a way to account for that future expected growth. And the share of the probability distribution of the large load forecast grows over time, as you would expect. So pretty small in the near term, roughly a third of the large load additions by 2030, and then approaching half of the large load additions by 2045. And if you look at the solid sections on this chart, you can see where our kind of near-term insight stops, right? In 2033, the solid sections flatten out here because that's the extent of the load that we're including based on specific requests and specific near-term information from customers. Okay. We touched on this a bit, and this is the expected result from updating the forecast, which is both a flattening load, at least for the next decade or so, and then an increasing New Mexico share once the oil and gas expansion starts to dominate the large load growth and it starts to outpace the EV growth. So seeing a shift of load to a shift of the majority of the peak being in New Mexico, and then the load just getting flatter throughout the year. And finally, looking at the load duration curves, it's interesting. I was really setting this graph up just to illustrate how our load was flattening over time. But then once you go out to where the system becomes winter peaking due to EV load, you can see it actually gets a little bit peakier just based on a handful of hours, which are there on the far left of the graph in the orange line. So we're already quite a high load factor system, about 77% in the expectations for 2026. Adding very flat oil and gas load, very flat data center load gets us to about 86% by 2035. And then once we switch to winter peaking and the EV charging starts to set a few peak hours during the winter time, you can see that there's a handful of really high hours that make the load factor go back down a little bit. To me, this highlights the opportunity to manage that EV charging to not, out of those handful, maybe top 50, top 100 hours, something like that, just to help flatten the loads and mitigate the peak and mitigate the seasonal shift of the peak a bit as well. Yep, open for questions on any of that information.
Great, thanks, John. Let's go ahead and open up our Q&A session for this particular segment, both load forecasting, plus if there's questions on the follow-ups that Jared presented. So please, if you have a question at this point, please, if you're on Zoom, raise your virtual hand. We'll call upon you. And if you're in the room in Albuquerque, please raise your hand, and Linda, maybe you can help us identify if somebody's got a question. Let's start with people on Zoom, questions here, and then we'll go to questions in the room. Jonathan, please go ahead. Please, at your question, when you start your question, please give your name and your organization. Thank you.
Oh, hi, good morning. My name is Jonathan with Oxy. I had a question, or I guess it's pretty open-ended, but could you talk a little bit more about the assumptions about EV adoption in the service territory? I may be misremembering, but it might have been in the transportation electrification plan, where I recalled reading that um, I guess EV adoption was kind of slower than projected. Are you guys anticipating any sudden acceleration of EV adoption, or is it kind of a business as usual growth that kind of leads to that shift in 2040?
Yeah, great question. And I'm not specifically familiar with the TEP reference that you're making. Adoption is fairly low right now, which might be what you're recalling. The way we do our EV modeling, it's kind of like a typical fast diffusion technology adoption modeling curve type forecast. So I don't. It's business as usual in that we expect there to be increasing adoption over time, but not like all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of vehicles in the next couple of years, right? So you do see that pace of adoption increase over time, and that's why you don't see that impact of the EV load, driving the peak to the winter for another decade and a half. Once you kind of hit that critical mass of EVs, where the charging patterns start to drive the load higher in the overnight hours, higher than the other peak loads.
Okay, so kind of to just sum up, there's not this like sudden wholesale like sea change that you guys are projecting. It's this kind of gradual organic growth, and it just so happens that over time it compounds.
Yeah, and the growth accelerates over time, but accelerates
Right.
kind of as a typical technology adoption accelerates.
Okay, yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, thanks for the question, Jonathan. Other questions from folks on Zoom? Linda, are there hands raised in the room there in Albuquerque?
Yes.
Yeah, this is James Hall, that's on mobile. I guess, Jared, you mentioned that you were considering potentially two models, one for Texas, one for New Mexico, if, given the kind of very different policies right between the two states. So is that part of the IR? Is that part of this process? Are you actually going to model what would need to be done if it just became apparent that, the two states are not able to sort of operate as a single grid? And then also, I know you don't know the costs until you do an RFP and see what the current market conditions are, but are you also kind of sort of generally anticipate the practical reality of the magnitude of cost that it would be if you had to get to 80% renewable by 2040 in New Mexico? So is there a kind of a generic cost modeling aspect, as well as are you going to look at these two grids separately as a contingency?
So I'm going to let Justin and Gable address those questions.
Thank you for the question. So it will be part of the IRP. Further on down the slides, we have a list of the conceptual modeling tree that we have. We've actually modeled a very similar kind of situation in the last certificate of needs need filings. We did some scenarios in New Mexico talking about what 2045 compliance would look like, and what we did in that modeling effort. And it's probably something we're still working on the modeling approach here, but it'd probably be very similar, where we ran the model for system-wide needs. It is just one model, no matter if it's a split system thing or not. It's one model, and we solve for least cost through 2045. And then what thermal resources that we see get pulled in that model. We looked at the Texas ratio share of that on like the load forecasting. And we took those thermal units and we basically said, you can follow the load ratio share. So the New Mexico share of those thermal resources we removed, and then we allowed the model to respin and without selecting any without selecting any thermal resources. So that gives us the cost delta, and also the resource mix difference that would have to be jurisdictionally assigned to accommodate both policies. But it's still within one model.
Okay. And that information is contained in this deck, or it will be coming at a later time when you finish the analysis?
Well, we'll have to complete that analysis, but that scenario is identified in the presentation. But if you can go back to those CCM filings if you're wanting to get some more information, or we can also talk about in office hours.
Yeah.
So it's just some specifics about what that scenario looked like from the last filings.
That's hard. Thank you.
James, was there another part to your question, or did your have your questions been answered?
No, that was both of it. You are looking at it on a separate state basis, and you are working out, and obviously going to come to the conclusion that having non-thermal solutions and purely renewable in New Mexico is going to be extraordinarily expensive, and you're going to get some insight into that magnitude by running that model in the future. So I look forward to seeing those results. So thank you.
Great, thanks you.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's important to understand what are some of the sensitivities people want to see. So appreciate you bringing those up. Making sure we're on the right track of what we're modeling or assuming the model.
The other question. So,
I think I've
yeah, we got one more here in the room. Margie?
okay.
So, yeah, I'd just be interested in,
Sorry, could you give your name and organization, please?
Yes, this is Orland Whitney. I'm with, from engineering at, NMPRC. My question is SPS, the PRC expects you all to fulfill your commitment in docket 25, 85, 00085. And it's a unanimous stipulation. So I imagine that's already been covered, but I think you covered it, Justin. But basically that's just one of the pros and cons of leaving SPP. And so so I think that's and all my other questions are basically office hour questions. So thank you.
Thanks everyone for the comments. I will say that that is another scenario that we do have laid out here. I'll have to find exactly where it's at, but that is something that we're looking at in general. Just a modeling approaches, I think might be a good point. Is just we have a capacity expansion and production cost control. It's a two-stage model, and during capacity expansion, as a part of last RFP, we've run scenarios where we did a markets on and markets off approach to capacity expansion. What we saw from the bid selection was that the bids were basically the same selections, no matter if you had markets on or markets off. Going forward, we are going to go, and this aligns with standard practices, to model the capacity expansion with always markets off. So the difference now, to go into your comment, is that on the production cost, we have always traditionally turned the market back on to allow it to be able to utilize that energy for market. A scenario which should be fairly easy to be able to do is just run the production cost run, which is an 8760 full hours of the year for 20 years, and just leave the markets off. So we'll have like the delta of like a markets off and markets on approach. Now that's not necessarily an all-inclusive look about what the market value is or the risk associated with that. Jared alluded to the fact of the exit fees and things like that. It's a partial part of that analysis, but I think it's the part of the analysis that you're most interested to see.
Yeah, and I think that was a great answer because from an engineering perspective, I think in kind of truth tables, right? So you toggle on and off whether or not your markets are participating. And so I think that was well answered. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just the impact of the Southwest Power Pool is we're very integrated with them. So the idea of at least this analysis is with the markets and the resources. Then there's the transmission component. Then there's the possibility of standing up our own EA balancing authority again. So a lot of the responsibilities that we've advocated back to the Southwest Power Pool for compliance, for control centers, for monitoring of our neighbors, for tie lines, those type of responsibilities would have to come back to us. So that's another aspect. So there's multiple different parts. We'll talk about some of those. We'll talk about some of the benefits, which then turn into costs if you're not part of them. So again, multiple pieces. We'll try to continue to piece that together for the questions. And Margie, anything else? Anybody else on Zoom with some questions?
Let's give a moment. Let's see if anyone else has in Zoom would like to raise their hand for a question on anything presented so far.
If I might interject, this is Kathy Boyce with GridWorks. While folks are thinking, Orland, could we go back? You said you had several other ideas for office hours. Can you just give us sort of an outline of it, just as we start to think about what the office hours, what would you like to see discussed on May 12th?
So, yeah, I've got several. So I think, I'm looking through SPS's slide deck and I'm on slide see, I can't really tell which slide I'm on here. Let's see, SPS loads and resources position. So.
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
Yeah, slide 26 there. And so, you know, for the 2026 and 2032 load step changes, you know, I'm seeing kind of a doubling. You know, I'm just interested in what specific customer or load classes drive the delta, and what portions backed by executed agreements versus speculative economic development forecasts.
Okay. Okay. And we'll come to that shortly and have another Q&A section. So maybe if we could pause on that and maybe address it today as well for the good of the group.
Sure. Sure. But most of my questions, I believe, are office hour questions such as that, you know.
Okay.
So yeah, but I can.
I'll just say, I mean, John, do you want to speak on 26 and 32? I mean, back on slide 12, I mean, we show that as trends of the forecasts and what we're expecting. I mean, can you speak in some of those inputs that drove 26 and 32's increases?
Right, and which customer classes drove that delta?
Yeah, getting to my unmute here. So, yeah, so the 2026 jump, it is a function of executed near-term service agreements. So I think you're reacting to the jump off the most recent actual. So you know we're approaching the summer here. Whether that full load comes online, you know, we'll know fairly shortly. And let me pull up the deck here and zoom into 2032. I guess is 2032 kind of the bottom of kind of that wavy pattern? I'm just having trouble seeing the years on the bottom there. But that's the alleviation of a constraint. So we've got a lot of near-term growth that is contracted that we are connecting, and that's kind of that near-term red growth. It flattens out a bit as the contracted growth, you know, to some degree, you know, we've connected it. Now it's not being connected anymore. And then once constraints are relieved, we're able to connect more of the load that's kind of in that gray line. And you can see once we get out to the early 2030s, the gray line is the red line because it is the same project. It's just the timing of being able to connect that load. As far as what's driving it, I mean, I break that out a little bit on the next slide. It's data centers and oil and gas for the most part. We could probably give a little more detail on office hours if you know, maybe some specific numbers behind that, but those are the key drivers of those two industries.
Or I'll just speak to that a little bit more is, you know, we're looking at all the transmission projects that we have in play. You know, I'll say Crossroads House Roadrunner, that was a double circuit 345 in New Mexico going in service this month. That's going to alleviate some challenges and some reliability issues. But then we also run into one of our big constraints over the last 2 years has been lack of resources to meet the growth of Southwest Power Point. You can see that in our L&R table. So then it comes down to the timelines of some of those service dates of those different resources, especially the resources that will allow our accredited position to increase. And so as soon as it increases, then we backfill that with load. And then if we run into a transmission constraint, once that's alleviated, we can backfill that again. So that's where you see some of those step increases along the way. And that's why they're kind of spaced out. It's not a continuous trend, so we can't just constantly fill in behind it because the resources themselves with the transmission are step increases. And so whether it's the 24 RFP results, the 25 RFP solutions that we don't have those service dates baked in, but we're kind of doing some approximations out there based off of the timelines and the load ramps that we put into that RFP. That this curve will constantly shift as if we're able to get resources to come online sooner, or if some of the load doesn't materialize as quickly, depending on different situations with different customers. So, but as John said, a lot of this is oil and gas driven, especially in the near term with the amount of pending customers. I think slide 12 really shows that unconstrained planning forecast that you can show it's really front loaded, but what we're actually forecasting is moving a lot of that load out because of those, we need to have the resources or the transmission in place to actually serve those customers.
Thanks. And maybe I can ask another question that's more policy related than engineering, I guess. But what I hear from stakeholders, there's a growing concern that New Mexicans are having energy done to them and not for them. And so, I think that, I hear that, and I'm not, I'm an engineer, so this is just what I hear. And so, how do you all take, serving the oil and gas industry and data centers, which we all use, how do you rank the social benefits of your load growth since you have a duty to serve? I guess that's not an engineering question. That's kind of a for the room question, or maybe something just to put out there on the table. But this is what I hear from stakeholders, and I know that that's a growing concern. So didn't mean to put a stinker out on the table there, but I think it's worth mentioning. New Mexicans are very concerned about having energy done to them, and this is maybe showing a little bit of my age now. The Milagro Beanfield Wars were about this, and about energy companies coming in and doubling their energy bills. And sometimes I think that there's a push and pull on humans love electricity, but they hate paying for it. So I'd like to just kind of hear your thoughts on how you rank the social benefits of this inflection point in energy we're at.
So I'll just say broadly, electricity is one of the greatest things ever created by mankind, and it's prevalent in everything that we do. So, but it's growing, right? The need, the desire, the influx of heavy electrified loads or data centers that consume lots amount of energy is growing very rapidly right now. We also have industries that have historically had emissions that are being asked to reduce those emissions, and the only way to reduce that is to electrify. And so our job as a utility is to serve customers that are requesting electricity and trying to do that at an affordable rate. And now that is where this interaction in IRPs comes into play. It's where our relationship with the commission comes into play. What we build is we're trying to do it in a very transparent manner. We run planning studies with our neighboring utilities in Southwest Power Pool. We do all source RFPs with our stakeholders, asking for everybody to bring their best projects forward that we can then model and look at. We're at a position right now, though, that there's a high demand for electricity, and we are working to solve that. Now, we're also looking at other projects and other products like large load tariffs, and in the future, a HILGA, high impact large load tariff. We're also looking at microgrid concepts. So we're looking at different ways to shift some of those costs, maybe to some of the direct beneficiaries and direct users. But at the same point, broadly, to maintain system reliability, a lot of those assets are system assets. And whether they're more large industrial or whether they're more residential focused, our system is more large C&I. But then that is where the engagement during rate cases comes into play to find what is that right balance of how those costs that are needed and are already previously identified as prudent by the commission are then properly allocated to those system. It is challenging. We hear these discussions at the Southwest Power Pool and talking with a lot of our peer utilities. This is not just a New Mexico challenge. It is a challenge everywhere. We have a uniqueness about ours where we have a very specific area that we're trying to serve some load, but we also have data centers also asking for a connection. How do we navigate those costs appropriately? So philosophical question with a philosophical answer. At the end of the day, is our responsibility is to serve load, and then we get asked every day, when are we going to serve more customers? And so to then also say is we also don't want to see an increase in prices is a very say delicate or difficult situation that we are trying to navigate, and we will continue to navigate in as much of a transparent manner as we're able to. At the end of the day, our job is to serve load in a reliable and cost-effective way. Not everybody will agree with me with that, and the answer is, but that is the process that we're walking through.
And this, yeah, I would add to that, Jared. It's Mike D'Antonio with Xcel Energy, and the guiding principle behind the ETA, right, the Energy Transition Act that we all are living by, and really has some pretty good foresight in that act with regards to not only requiring the renewable portfolio standards that it does and timeframes, but it's also got the off ramps of affordability and reliability, which we hope are going to be considered, with PRC. And so those are some of the aspects that we look at and saying, hey, if we want natural gas in our portfolio, it actually will help. And again, looking at a portfolio look and not at an individual asset. It's the most beneficial portfolio for our customers, and get back to the affordability and the social aspect that you're addressing. So we're hoping that has a big impact on the resource mix going forward.
Mr. Hall, is that a question or a comment?
I suppose it's from sort of philosophy. It's sort of a philosophical comment as opposed to.
Sorry, James, we're having a hard time hearing you. Please speak up.
James Willis, Michael, on the topic of philosophy and kind of benefits. I understand the concern around oil and gas creating, new load demand. But there's a pretty obvious societal benefit to New Mexico as well, right? So I don't want that to be lost in the conversation either. I mean, it's like $7.5 billion worth of revenue to the state in 2024 alone, which is half the state revenue, flipping the budget to having a surplus, and the more load that you can supply sort of responsibly and allow oil and gas to expand, the more state revenue that provides, and the more prosperity it provides for the state. So there's a pretty massive economic good news story comes along with this, and I would just like to sort of put that on the record that that's part of the conversation that we need to remember as well.
Can we add one more philosophical comment?
Introduce yourself.
Conversation. This is Carrie Hatley with ConocoPhillips, and I definitely would like to. I really appreciate the spirit of the question. I am a lifelong New Mexican myself, and I live in New Mexico, and I consider myself part of your constituent base when you talk about electricity for New Mexicans. And I echo what James's comments about the social good provided by many of these different industries and different electric customers to the state. And I think that if we look back on electric load growth, it can largely be kind of lumped into two types. There's this kind of natural load growth that happens from cities growing and populations growing that is somewhat predictable and slow and steady. And then there's spot load growth from industries. And that's a story as old as electricity has had a grid. I mean, we used to see that from manufacturing centers and different smelters and large loads like that. And then now we're talking about oil and gas. And then we're also quickly talking about data centers. It's a story that changes, but it's all woven together in the social fabric of every state. And I think that, collectively, New Mexicans should include industry and all those other different types of load as well. It's all part of mix. There's not like an us versus them or this versus that.
Thanks, Carrie. Let's go ahead. Jared, I'm going to ask that we don't need to continue this line of it's very good input, but I think we need to move on to our next conversations. Thank you for that policy foray, folks. That was great. We have like to go ahead and take a 10-minute break while we regroup and get the next set of presentations. We'll focus next on the presentation on the modeling framework. So we will resume our conference here in 10 minutes. I show at 10:04. At 10:14 we will resume. And Linda, I'd like to do a quick logistics check with you. Would you like to do that on cell phone?
Sure.
Great. I think we need to adjust a little bit. We're having a hard time hearing Justin and Jared. So let me get you on the cell phone. We'll put everybody else on break for 10 minutes and we'll be back at 10:14.
Yeah. Happy to see you.
Work together and we'll be our best for our other seats very quickly.
Thank you. Welcome back. Two quick announcements before we get going. First of all, many of you have heard the reference to office hours. You will hear more about that at the end of the workshop that we've planned to schedule an office hours segment on May 12th. Please keep track of topics you are interested in diving deeper into as we go through today. And if you haven't had your curiosity or your interest satisfied with the presentation, we'll ask you toward the end of this workshop to give us topics that you would like considered for this office hour session on May 12th. One other announcement, we have some new participants today that we have not been able to know whether we'll have you on our distribution list. And so there are 5 folks on the call by Zoom. We'd like to ask you to please put into chat your organization and your email. Here are the 5 people we're asking to do that. Bernie Liu, Demya Toogood, J.L. Camburn, Rijan Karki or Karki Rijan, we're not sure. Sorry if I've misoriented that name. And someone who's logged in as TD246. So Bernie Liu, Demya Toogood, JL Canburn, TD246, and Karki Rijan. Will you please give us your email address and organization in the chat so we make sure we've got a good record and can make sure you get announcements. Thank you, Rijan. Appreciate that. With that, thank you. We've made a few adjustments to put Justin and Jared closer to the microphone. Hopefully that will make it easier for those of you to hear on Zoom. And with that, Justin would like to turn it back over to you to talk about modeling.
Thank you, Margie. Can you hear me better?
Continue
Margie,
on.
can you hear me?
Say some more, Justin.
Can you hear me, Margie?
Yes, please speak up. Yep.
Okay. You know what? We'll switch mics real quick.
Okay.
And I can also text you to come over quickly if we need.
It's just Margie, is that better or is it still rough?
It's better. It's better, but it's not perfect. Just continue to speak up and speak slowly, Justin. That would be great. Thank you.
All right. It might be a very not a great camera angle, but I'm moving a little bit closer. So
That's much better. Wherever you are now, stay put.
I'll do it. Sam, thank you so much. All right. So I just looked it up. I've got 20 slides approximately in about 20 minutes. So I know we're not going to be able to cover all of this, and I don't want to read the material to everybody. So I'm going to hit a few of the highlights here, and I'm going to get to some of the more slides that I think that could either lend itself to some more conversation. So on the modeling front, the very first slide we have is why we use the Encompass model in integrated resource planning. And the reason is for a number of factors. Some of them I'm calling out here is because it is a consistent tool to be evaluating resources on a fair and equal basis. It allows us to compare all these different technology types on a unified optimization framework. It also allows us to be able to look at a cost-effective portfolio. The model's intent is the solution for the least cost scenario. So it's taking all of these different resource technologies, it's taking these market energy forecasts, fuel forecasts, and it's going through a system of decision making to provide the lowest cost to serve the customers effectively. It's also a great tool because it provides some operational feasibility modeling. So we have a two-stage expansion model, a two-stage model, like I mentioned earlier, a capacity expansion and a production costing. So capacity expansion, that process of the model is where we are actually selecting either new, in the IRP process, selecting new generic resources to be able to fill a need. And then we move to a production costing scenario, which looks at the full hourly dispatch for the optimization period, the optimization being for 20 years. So a full 8760-hour run for every single year in the 20-year horizon. And so it's a very good about developing an expansion and then testing that expansion on a full hourly operation. It also gives us a lot of opportunity to develop different scenario and sensitivity analysis and be able to permutate on these different types of analysis. So we can test and do different policy constraints, such as the RPS requirements through 2030, 40, and 45. We can also be looking at fuel price variations of low, medium, high gas prices, as well as market forecasts, specific types of technologies and understanding emerging tech. Well, the models may say that the least cost solution is utilizing the generic resources that we traditionally think of, like wind or solar, 4-hour batteries, thermal generation. But we may also want to look at emerging tech and see, well, the model is not necessarily selecting these things natively. What happens if we were to swap these out to just kind of see what is the delta that we're talking about when we're trying to adopt an emerging technology for a specific situation or as a general alignment with policy. So it's a very robust tool. There's a couple of things here. I mentioned a couple of the main benefits and values here, but I want to talk about some of the limitations here. It's not a nodal power flow model. So there are other types of models, and Encompass can be configured to be a nodal representation of the system. However, we utilize it as a zonal representation. That allows us to get us that full 20-year planning horizon and look at that. But it requires us to simplify some of the transmission on the system. So, and we'll talk a little bit down below on the model topology that we have inside of Encompass. But there are some simplifications that we have to do to get that zonal representation through the full 20-year planning horizon. Utilizing a nodal analysis would allow us to look at LMPs on a much more granular level. However, as the transmission system is changing over time, that nodal representation that we may put into the model becomes less and less accurate through time. So you would be making decisions on a level of accuracy that's not necessarily aligned in the 15-20-year horizon. So some of the limitations of that model, and that's just a function of the world that we're living in. As resources are selected and move forward through time, the transmission system has to change. And there is a little bit of a circular reference, a chicken and egg kind of situation where you're developing transmission, you're developing resources, and all of these things do have inputs into each other. So that's why we move with Encompass. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move past this next slide. We'll go past this slide. You can look at this one. I don't want to necessarily read that one to you. As well as this one, we kind of talked a little bit about it, the capacity expansion, production costs. The information's here. Please take time to review the slides if you have more questions about what I'm going through. Office hours are going to be a great opportunity to expand on some of this information. This also just helps us, this last slide here about the Encompass model kind of further illustrates the point that I was making about constraints or limitations of the model. The more granularity, the more complexity that we add in the model increases runtime. There are times that we've gotten the model so complex that it takes weeks to run the model, and being able to iterate and make decisions off of that becomes limited because of the time constraints associated with that. So that's the point I'd like to make here. And we'll just jump into the next slide, which is the LNR table. Orland's question earlier kind of already talked a little bit about this LNR table, but this right here is our LNR position assumed with the planning forecast that Dr. Goodenough had presented earlier. You can see that we are having some immediate needs now, but they escalate very quickly into the early 2030s. We're providing the LNR here on a seasonal basis to align with the seasonal requirements at the Southwest Power Pool. Some key points that you might want to notice here is the PRM lines. The PRM on the winter position is significantly higher than it is on the summer. At Southwest Power Pool, on a nameplate basis, the PRM today is about 36%, and it increases. And that increases, you can see that in this LNR. In the summer, that number is 16%, and it increases as well over time. Those numbers, though, if you were to actually just go out here and get a calculator and start doing the math here, they don't necessarily equate to 36% and 16%. But that is because when SPP is comparing your L&R table or matching your loads to your resources, they are looking at that on an accredited capacity basis. So the PRM is also adjusted for accredited capacity. So today, that 36% in the winter translates to about 15%. There's some fluctuations there, and it will fluctuate every single year. So 36% PRM the winter 26-27, and the 36% 27-28 may not necessarily both be the same accredited capacity requirement every year. So that's a little bit about this. I'll pause here, see if there's any additional questions about the L&R table. I don't know that there is.
Justin,
I'll pause for a second.
Justin, can you just add what the units are on this graph, please?
Yes, ma'am. They're all in megawatts.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So just some interesting things here. You can see that the SPS owned. You can see that is we'll just stick with the winter just because at the top. 26-27, you see a 38-28. That's where we're at. And by 2031-32, that is reducing by about 1,000 megawatts. You can see that the line below that is the 24 RFP. So you can see that the resources that were selected in the RFP are making substantial increases to our capacity position. But there are a number, and we spoke about this previously in some of the last stakeholder meetings. We do have a number of retirements and also PPA expirations that are happening. So that is partly a function in here, and there's also a function of declining ELCCs. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a few slides down, but ELCCs, the effective load carrying capability of wind, solar, battery storage resources, as time goes on and the level of the penetration of those resource types into the SPP market, ultimately has a declining effect on the ability for that technology type to be relied upon dependably during peak load hours. All right. Jump to the next slide. And this is as a response to one of the questions we got. We were asked to provide an energy mix by 2030. This information is based upon the 2024 RFP results. We don't necessarily have the updated modeling that we're going to be producing in this IRP. So this is subject to change, obviously. And it also does not reflect Dr. Goodenough's load forecast, as this was based on 24 RFP. So you can see, though, that we have a very diverse system, a very diverse set of resources of both wind, CTs, CCs, traditional steam turbine technologies. And you can also see that we have a 7% expectation of market reliance. So the next couple slides, just generally, I put in here, we have some more slides talking about modeling inputs, but this is just our generic resource pricing that we're assuming for some of our more traditional technology types. You can see here, this is for renewable resources. Pricing was expected to be on the downward trend. You can see that the expiration of the federal PTCs, production tax credits going away. We are estimating an increase in the near term of those prices, but the general trend is still downward on a real basis downwards. You can also see that we have this dotted line above each one of the solid lines. The dotted line represents 125 kW transmission adder. So the transmission adder, that is a function to represent our expectations, or just our general expectations of what transmission network upgrade costs are to connect these technology types to the grid. So, gen ties, substation POI connections, things like that. So the next slide, that represents our generic resource pricing for battery energy storage systems. So you can see there's 3 line items on here, 8, 6, and 4 hours. general trend downwards towards those the cost on a $26 basis.
There's a legend issue with that graph.
There is. Thank you for pointing that out. And we will get it corrected. I actually noted that with Linda earlier, but we didn't have a chance to. But it should follow the same time horizons that you see in the last slide for renewables. Apologize for that. All right, and the next slide, our generic resource pricing that we are assuming inside of the model right now. All right, so I'm sure that there's a lot to digest there. We do have office hours. If anybody wants to discuss those numbers further, or either basis of how we came up with those values. This next slide is our topology map. So I said earlier that there are simplifications in the model to represent the transmission system. This is what that representation is. So the orange that you see on this graph is what we consider our load area bubbles. So basically the Texas and New Mexico system, we split it into 3 load areas: SPS North, SPS South, and SPS Southeast. And Southeast is obviously to what in this graph would be the West, but that represents Southeast New Mexico. And then there's below that, you can see what we have is the transmission interface limit changes. So as you can see through time, we are attempting to model the improvements or changes to transmission constraints between these load area bubbles in the Encompass model. You can see that there's a number of improvements specifically between Southeast and South load areas through the late 2029 to 3032. There's also what you see on here as the SPS new generation bubble. So when we are modeling and we're allowing the model to make a capacity expansion for generic resources of the model, this is where those resources are sitting. And the connection that you see between the dark blue on the left, it is left on your side too, on the left, that's where all those resources sit. And then the blue lines that are connecting them have no transmission constraint between those load area bubbles. So as load is increasing in any one of these different areas, a resource that gets selected can freely flow into those load area bubbles. So as the model is selecting new generation resources, whether that's wind or solar, those can flow.
I think we would see that. Sorry, who objected?
Sorry,
Go ahead. Little interference. We got it.
So those resources can flow to any one of those load area bubbles. We do have that 125 kW adder or to represent transmission. This, however, can be a very significant difference between an IRP modeling effort and an RFP selection. So when we have an IRP, these projects are getting distributed out across these load areas as needed where load growth is happening. However, in a resource selection, those projects have defined characteristics such as location or network upgrade cost that may not necessarily be what was modeled in the IRP process. If the DICES process, if in the DICES process there is not, for instance, a 200 megawatt wind project in the Southeast bubble, although it's flowing in the IRP, that represents a difference in what could be physically built and what would be optimal solution based upon the Encompass model. I'll pause there. I don't know if anybody's got any questions about topology of the model.
Justin, we're going to ask you to continue
I
on.
would just love for you to
session here after when you complete. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. We do have one question that we will remember to come back to. All right, so this next slide, going to the modeling tree. One more slide. All right, this slide right here, this lays out my conceptual ideas on what we will be modeling in this IRP. And we have another slide after this one that talks about some specific sensitivities that we're looking to run. In general, you can see we're going from left to right, and the red arrows kind of establish like a parent-child relationship. So on the left-hand side, the main modeling approaches are going to be related to the load forecast. In Dr. Goodenough's presentation earlier, he had both an unconstrained planning, a constrained planning, and a load forecast. So the constrained planning is what we consider our base scenario. So we'll have these three different scenarios, but all child scenarios after that will really be based upon the constrained planning forecast. After that, and this goes back to Orland's comments about the market interaction, we have the scenarios of both an islanded approach and a non-islanded approach. So capacity expansions would be the same between these, markets off, but then the production cost runs, we would have a potential delta in the net present values of the resource selections and the market relationships. After that, you can see in the non-islanded approach, that would be the next level of parent-child relationship. So everything else after that would be based upon the non-islanded approach. That's our base case scenario where we model the assumption of a market interaction. In that scenario, there's kind of a couple of different things. The Energy Transition Act, talking about specifically about once we have developed our least cost solution to be able to satisfy customer needs, adding in the specific environmental constraints that represent the REC requirements related to the Energy Transition Act, all the way through 2045, which represents a carbon zero. So that top scenario, incremental, is a very similar approach that we provided in our last filings of the 24 RFP. The CC is related with it. The other approach that we're talking about is the deconstructed system, where we also have that approach where we are taking that least cost scenario, locking the thermal resources that are of the Texas ratio share, and then allowing the model to re-optimize the solution out to New Mexico incremental requirements for RPS. The interesting thing about that, and I think this comment was kind of brought up earlier, is currently, if your RPS, your renewable portfolio standard, is asking for REC generation, so 50%, 80%, 2040, batteries in particular are not necessarily, they're not necessarily a generator of RECs. They can help if they are they can help in this situation by being able to avoid curtailments and things like that. But in a deconstructed system, when we lock the thermal generation for Texas and we allow the model to respin, it will create a capacity hole. So it will select renewables to be able to solution out the incremental RPS needs, but it may also pull in batteries to be able to solution out the capacity as well. So the capacity resources, in this case batteries, would not necessarily be a direct contributor to REC compliance as much as it is to establish or to backfill the capacity that's left from the loss of thermal resources. That was kind of wordy, so if there's any questions, please let me know and we can talk a little bit more about it. All right. Just one further step on that deconstructed system. I do think that there's opportunities specifically to talk about there will be a least cost solution to solve for that scenario. However, it may be that emerging tech would not be selected. This is where we can start doing some specific sensitivities on well, let's take out these 4-hour batteries and let's plug in a long duration storage. How does that look? It may not necessarily be the least cost solution, but how close is it to the least cost solution? So trying to understand some of those specific sensitivities that these emerging techs could help solution. The other two items below that, data centers and fuel pricing, you can see that the arrows are coming back from the non-islanded. So these are scenarios that are not necessarily related to the environmental constraints of the Energy Transition Act, but they are sensitivities that we believe need to be demonstrated to let folks understand what the incremental build out is for an example 1 gigawatt data center in either a scenario where we are allowing that data center to be served by thermal resources or traditional resources, and that same scenario where we allow the data center to only be solutioned by non-carbon emitting resources. So, and then also a fuel sensitivity. All right. this slide's kind of a little bit bare, but these are some of the things that were just coming out of my mind of things that we also want to do additional sensitivities on. We have some specific opportunities for replacement in this IRP planning horizon. Specifically, I thought that the most interesting one could be Quay County. Quay County is currently a 24 megawatt CT that is within the city limits of Tucumcari. That facility represents backup generation for the city in case of a transmission outage that services that community. That unit is scheduled to retire within the optimization period of this IRP. And so we do propose to do sensitivities where we solution either with traditional resources or potentially long duration storage or other kinds of emerging tech. So more to come on that. Also, Harrington and Nichols, those are gas steam generations in Amarillo. In the past IRP, it was something that was looked at as a potential location where nuclear could go in. It was never selected as a least cost solution in the Encompass model, but we do think that we should revisit that for the potential for that technology type is probably our best opportunity on the SPS system. We also have Cunningham 3 and 4. Those are combustion turbines, potentially doing a sensitivity where we look at fuel cells going at those locations. So be thinking about this slide, other sensitivities, other modeling kind of efforts, and we would really appreciate any feedback that folks may have. All right. So here's some more inputs. I feel like I'm running out of time, but the next 3 slides are directly from Southwest Power Pool, and these represent the effective load carrying capability of wind, solar, and storage resources, specifically 4-hour storage resources on the SPP system. So what you're seeing here on the y-axis is the level of accredited capacity percentage, and then on the right, the x-axis is you're seeing the megawatts of that technology type on the Southwest Power Pool system. You can see that wind is traditionally very stable. There's a lot of penetration of this technology type in the system, so we would not expect a very large decline as this technology continues to mature in the Southwest Power Pool system. On these graphs, you also see a winter and a summer line, as the accreditation is based upon seasonal. Go to the solar slide, please. Most of this makes intuitive sense. So, for solar in particular, you can see that winter has a much lower level of accreditation. So there are technology types that, as you are developing, could potentially increase the delta between your summer and winter positions. So there is the PRM differences, the higher 13% and 16% in winter, or 16% in summer PRM requirements. There's also changes in what we're expecting upon winter and summer peaks that are happening through times, but technology types that are being incorporated into your system can also change the delta of your capacity position. Solar is just a really good example of that. It's just a very clear slide. So on the next slide, this is the 4-hour ESR. SPP did not provide a 6 or 8 hour version of this slide, so we only have the 4-hour. But you can also see that there's a significant difference between summer and winter for battery storage as you increase penetration of these technology types on the Southwest Power Pool. So these 3 slides were all what was directly provided from SPP, and you can see that the next slide, this is what SPP has taken that information and has extrapolated out to specifically the SPS system. So this is currently what we are incorporating into the IRP model for the ELCCs of these different technology types. I'm assuming that there will be conversations or questions about this that we would be tabling until we get to office hours. So pointedly, ELCC is or we've been talking about ELCC as it affects renewables and battery storage technologies. We haven't talked about thermal, and that's because it's based upon performance-based accreditation. We won't go too far into this slide, but currently performance-based accreditation has been adopted at Southwest Power Pool. It is incorporated in our L&R tables. There is a delta between summer and winter, and it's based upon forced outage rates in those seasons for those resources. And they're directly assigned to each specific resource. It is not something that is just peanut butter spread across the resource types. So the next couple of slides, the next 3 slides, are specifically related to batteries. This is a response to some questions that we've received in some of the last stakeholder meetings. So just kind of a gut check kind of look at batteries, 4-hour batteries in particular. These slides that we're about to go into, they don't necessarily, this is not ELCC. This is just a, hey, what if we just looked at it as like a peak shaving? How much capacity could you accredit a battery resource to? So in this example, I took 1,000 megawatts of 4-hour best batteries, and I took the summer peak and the winter peak days, and I took the 24 hours, and I basically said, manage my peak to the lowest point possible in both the summer and the winter. And so you can see in the top graph to the right, this is the summer. And you can see that 1,000 megawatts of batteries, because you also have to charge the batteries. So you can't just lower the peak and not also raise the valley. So as you're doing that 1,000 megawatts has the ability to lower this, in this instance, if you were just looking at this, and this is not how we would necessarily operate the batteries, but you could reduce the peak by 606 megawatts. So you can see that just in a peak shaving exercise, 1,000 megawatts does not necessarily equate to 1,000 megawatts of accredited capacity. Now, again, this is not ELCC. It's just a peak shaving exercise, but it demonstrates the kind of the point. You can see in the winter, the same activity, we could only reduce the peak by 310 megawatts with that 1,000 megawatts. Now, these are just examples, and this is just a peak shaving exercise. But it does demonstrate that there are seasonal differences between how batteries can perform in the future. Any questions on this slide? Okay.
Justin, I'm not going to let you finish, and then we'll open for questions. Hopefully, you're about completed.
Okay, I will rush through the next ones. So the next 2 slides these are from expired forecasts. I didn't have the forecasts that John has provided when I developed these graphics, but I still think that it is important. So you can flip between the 2 next slides because there's a winter and a summer load duration curve. So this is basically every hour of the year in 2030, or every hour of the season in 2030. So winter 2030, and then for summer 2030. You can see that the winter is very horizontal. This goes back to John's comments about the load factors. The load factors in winter are very stable, very high. I have this purple arrow down the bottom left-hand side, and you can see that if you're looking at a 4-hour battery and you were just to assume that the 4-hour battery was utilized every single day, that's how far into the graph it could penetrate. About 6% of the hours for that season. The same thing for the summer. Now, what you're seeing, what these colors represent, the red is the solar, the green is the renewables from wind, and then you have the rest of the demand. And the rest of that demand needs to be serviced by some sort of firm resource. The purple that you're seeing at the top, and this is an actual Encompass modeling run, the purple at the top that you're seeing, that's actual battery dispatch in here. So you can see that blue is the rest of the load that still has to be served by some kind of generation that either batteries or renewables are not accommodating. So I'll pause there. Margie, I think that we can open up for questions now.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Justin. Let's go first to people on Zoom for questions about the whole modeling framework, the sensitivity scenarios, inputs. Any questions? First, please raise your hand on Zoom, and then we'll go to the room in Albuquerque. We've got a hand from Jonathan. Please go ahead. Please state your
Oh,
name, organization again, and continue with your question.
hi, this is Jonathan Lee with Oxy again. I had a quick question about the ELCC slides. It's just kind of this interesting pattern that I observed where I guess it's especially apparent in the solar trends, but it looks like the ELCCs seem to converge between the seasons at higher penetration. Do you have any insight into that pattern, why that might be happening? I'll notice it's kind of to a lesser extent observed on the wind as well, just because those are already kind of close. Um, but it's a little less pronounced in the case of the storage resources. Yeah, I think it's these three slides that I'm thinking of.
Yes, Jonathan, I might have to get back to you with a better answer to this question, but you would assume that every technology type would have some base level of dependable capacity. And so as you're going through time, you're reaching that asymptotic value of the minimum net dependable capacity for these resource types. So with enough penetration, you're going to converge on what that value is. But I could probably provide you a better answer in the office hours.
Okay, I appreciate that. It's so effectively the short of it is there's some floor to how low the ELCC of these resources gets, and it looks like they're approaching that floor regardless of season.
Correct. That would be my general interpretation of the information.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Other questions from people on Zoom? I know Justin's put out a lot of information there. If they can answer questions now and don't have to defer to the office hour, it'd be great to get to them. We have time for this topic now. So any questions on Zoom before we go to the room? Okay, Justin, Jared, and Linda, are there questions, hands raised in the room there in Albuquerque?
I believe we have at least one. He answered my question. Oh, he did. Okay, Carrie's question was answered.
Okay.
I see no more hands in the room, Margie.
So Margie, if I might jump in while we just give a pause to see if there's any final question, Justin, that you had at the very beginning in the Q&A from workshop 2, and I think you referenced on your nodal and zonal topology. Is interregional transmission modeled as a supply side resource?
Not exactly. You could probably call it that, but inside the model, it's not a resource. It is an area that has a specific price for energy, and it's constrained through the transmission constraints. And you can go back to the topology slide, which is slide 31. So the market purchases are represented as an area, and there's transmission constraints, and there's a price for that energy. So the model can always, well, not always, in production costs where the market's turned on, it can draw from that area for the hourly energy price up to the transmission constraint limit. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sam Eisenberg here in the room.
Yeah, Jared, I think Jared's gonna take this. Can you go to 33?
33, yes.
Yeah, so on slide 33, we're really talking about the modeling trees for the conceptual models that we want to run for this analysis. And so I just want to really reiterate to the stakeholders listening in on this is that we really need some feedback on this. So if you guys want to follow up with GridWorks or directly with Linda afterwards, or between now and the next couple of weeks, that'd be extremely beneficial. I mean, this is the kind of the crux of what we're trying to analyze. Are we going down the right path? Are we looking at the right sensitivities? Are we, is there something else that we need to be focusing in on? Are we putting too much on something? Are we not putting it on enough to something else that somebody considers a really important sensitivity? We really encourage, honestly, need this feedback because this is what's going to drive our analysis. That's going to drive our end results in this IRP from the modeling perspective. So just If you don't have a thought, comment, or consideration for today, please spend some time thinking about it and provide some feedback to GridWorks and or Linda Hudgens. Their contact information, I believe, is on the GridWorks webpage, so we can make sure that we are taking into account stakeholder views.
So let's pause there, Jared. I think that's an excellent question. And I think there's a few people on Zoom who are practiced modeling organizations. And I'm going to take the risk to ask a couple of them if they would like to make a comment on this slide. I know that we've got representatives from Grid Lab, from the Coalition of Clean Affordable Energy, and from Large Customer Group. I wondered if any of those folks had some particular questions or thoughts about this modeling tree. Nikhil or Sydney or Rick, anything that you wanted to add, any reactions you have to this modeling tree concept? We'd love to hear from you. Yeah, go ahead, Taylor.
Hey, this is Taylor from Grid Lab, working with CCAE. I don't think we have any specific comment right now. We're kind of chatting in the background that I think generally this conceptual tree looks pretty good from a scenario development perspective, and um, I think we're interested in various sort of creative mixes, particularly around some of the combined ETA scenarios and sensitivities. I don't think we have any specific reactions. We'll probably have to digest this a little bit, but are definitely interested in some of those uh, ETA pathways, as well as I think the data center sensitivities, the load sensitivities, as well as some of the new tech considerations.
Great, thanks, Taylor. Um, Anybody else? Also, I see we've got representatives from the NRDC, the National Resources Defense Council, and from Austin, you're here also. I know you've been involved in modeling conversations in the past. Any reactions or thoughts from anybody at this point on this modeling tree and what else you'd like to see, or if you like the suite of modeling activities been presented, be important to hear from you. I see Chelsea is on as well from EFG. So just giving specific folks who I think have modeling interests an opportunity to comment.
Well, since you called me out, I guess I'll say this is interesting. I've actually just been studying this for the past couple of minutes, and I think the ETA impacts are really interesting to look at going forward. I don't have a lot of feedback at the moment, but certainly something that me and our group will be looking at and providing feedback going forward.
Great, Austin, thank you so much.
We briefly saw a hand from Amanda.
Yeah, if you can hear me, I think very similar. Still interpreting and kind of like looking at this generally, I think that this modeling tree looks good to me. I think one of the things that will be important to figure out, especially on some of the sensitivities, for example, are just availability, technology costs, and performance, and those kind of more nitty-gritty assumptions. So to me, this conceptual modeling tree makes a lot of sense. I think it's really going to come down to what do the ultimate assumptions look like.
Great, thank you. And as we get to the end of the workshop, SPS team will describe how people can, with appropriate access, dig into the details of some of those assumptions, but they're also open to discussing them with the group in workshops and office hours. So thank you, Amanda. That was Amanda with the NRDC. Any other questions about anything that Justin has presented? Justin, go ahead.
Mike Antonio here in the room. Question with regards to, with the microgrid legislation that passed recently. I guess the question is, where does this fit best? I mean, I see it fitting in the emerging tech space. Data centers aren't the only ones that are looking at microgrid kinds of stuff. How is that being modeled or being contemplated?
Okay, so microgrids are something that we are definitely looking at. I don't know that at this time the modeling approach is the way to really look at that, because we're really looking at that as more of a short-term solution, like a bridge project. So, we're trying to get customers connected. If we're looking at microgrids, that's going to be owned by a third party, and it's really to get somebody transitioned to getting on to the system, but providing an opportunity to get them on quicker. So I don't know that there's a place inside of our modeling tree that really incorporates that. We're actively in solutioning 2 sites right now. We're in the RFP stage for microgrid providers right now. We expect 12 to 15 months from customer contact to microgrid connection. So that really is a much more near-term kind of bridge solution than it is for like a long-term 20-year optimization planning perspective.
Great, thank you.
So we still need to plan for that level of load.
Coming back onto the system.
Right. We can't take that out of our planning. If we are planning for it, and then whenever it appears, the microgrid goes away.
Exactly. Thank you, Linda.
Great, thank you.
Okay, that's allowed.
We do have another question here in the room, Margie.
Please go ahead.
Follow up on John's question.
Sorry, who's speaking?
This is Carrie Hatley with ConocoPhillips. Just a quick follow-up on Mike's question about the microgrids. I'm wondering if SPS is modeling microgrids as just part of their overall portfolio instead of just in response to customer demand, as kind of just an alternative to how resources have traditionally been brought online with large generation resources and then a lot of transmission moving around. If you're looking at kind of more using microgrids close to the load pocket as a portfolio planning option, and how that works in the model.
Right now, at the moment, that's not something we're looking to incorporate in the model. We do really see it as a short-term solution. So as we would bring in a microgrid, solution it in the near term, as we get system resources on, that microgrid would go away or potentially get moved to a different location. But the ultimate goal is to get them onto the system as a long-term solution.
And then just a very quick additional question about modeling, if that's all right to ask. So I appreciate all the feedback from the modeling experts on Zoom. For those of us who aren't modeling experts, I'm wondering if there could be a scenario, and perhaps this is an office hours conversation or maybe a breakout group for those of us who aren't used to modeling, if we could run through this conceptual modeling tree in real time, like putting it through a model and seeing like in real time how everything is changing, or maybe a generic version of a model doesn't have any proprietary impacts for SPS or something like that, just so we can see how it changes when you add all these.
I think we can definitely provide the outputs of those. I will say that it's not something that like in an office hour we're going to be able to like hit run and see the outputs.
Okay.
It's hit run, potentially wait days.
Okay.
Then we go to production costing and then wait even more days before we actually see like the results. Okay. So it's not something that can be isolated to a specific or office hours, but we can talk about inputs or scenarios that you want in office hours. We can take it back, run it, and then we can review it again in the office hours. So it might just be a little bit more of an expansive conversation than you were envisioning.
Great, good. Thank you, Carrie. Any other question in the room? Or on Zoom? Last call for questions related to this very deep modeling framework. It's complex and it's complicated, but Justin did a great job describing it, and there'll be more opportunities for conversation as we dig deeper into modeling starting in the next workshop. So with that, Jared, Justin, are you good with us moving on to the emerging technology portion of your presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Just for the continued pulley to reach out and engage. as we continue to move along in modeling. So ready to turn it over to Dr. Moot.
All right. Just to start, can you all hear me okay online?
Yes, Taylor, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So first, just to start, I just wanted to put up here one of the advanced generation and storage technologies that are not currently on our system that we are looking to model in this IRP. So you have traditional nuclear, so your AP1000s. You have fuel cells. We've talked about them a little bit already. You have long duration energy storage. So for us, that's roughly 10 hours to 100 hours. You have next generation geothermal, advanced nuclear, so your small modular reactors, as well as green hydrogen and carbon capture. This is a simpler version of a slide I shared previously, where we talk about kind of when is this technology going to be ready in SPS specifically. So many of these technologies are being deployed elsewhere right now, but that doesn't mean that they can come to our area immediately. So you'll see nuclear and fuel cells, those are available today. Some long duration energy storage technologies are ready today. Not all of them. There are many that are still early. Next generation geothermal with transmission build out, maybe a mid 2030s opportunity. Advanced nuclear, late 2030s. And then as for reasons we'll get into later, carbon capture and green hydrogen, we're seeing those now as later 2040 activities. Let's go to the next slide. So the way we got to those numbers of when those technologies are ready is we went through and did an adoption readiness analysis. So this is a 6 to 9 month process that the team that I'm on went through for all these technologies. The adoption readiness is a framework that the DOE put out a few years ago. And what it does is it looks at things beyond technology maturity. It says, yes, the technology is de-risked, but what is the cost? Is it actually economic? Can it actually be selected in an IRP? What is that policy and regulatory maturity? Are there policies that actually enable this, or are there policies that hinder these technologies? Is there existing infrastructure for it? Do we have the transmission we need? Do we need CO2 pipelines? Do we need hydrogen infrastructure? Does it have the supply chain and value chains that is needed for these technologies? Do we have access to the rare earths that we might need for certain battery technologies? Does it have the workforce to actually build these technologies, to operate these technologies, all those things? And then last, what is the community sentiment around these technologies? Are these technologies welcome and asked for in the states and the regions that we're serving? So across all of that, that's how we got to those numbers for 2030, 2040, and today. I know I'm going quickly, but we can talk a lot about this more. So when we do this and we look across all the technologies, this is kind of where we end up. Again, this is a very simple slide, but this is 9 months of work, so we can talk about all the details of why these are green, green, yellow, yellow, red, all of that. Again, long duration energy storage, the technology is pretty mature. At least there are many technologies that are quite mature. We're seeing that costs are coming down quickly. Policy for more or less is quite translatable from the 4 hour to the long duration. And then a lot of the supply chains, workforce, infrastructure, and public support is more or less there for long duration. So those are some of the technologies that we see as ready today. Geothermal and advanced nuclear, we see as potentially ready in the 2030s. Geothermal a lot earlier in the 2030s, nuclear later in the 2030s. Some of that due to cost, some of that due to policy maturity, and then also just that sector maturity. Does there have infrastructure specifically for geothermal and SPS? And then policy maturity in nuclear is challenging. While there is a significant amount of federal support, the states that we operate in have different perspectives on nuclear. So that makes it slightly complicated there. And then carbon capture and clean fuel, I kind of mentioned this, but their cost maturity just right now is not great. Some of you maybe think a lot about carbon capture and have different opinions. Happy to talk about that, as well as with any of these other technologies. But from our analysis, we're a little nervous that those costs aren't great right now. That's really what's hindering those. So to kind of reiterate what Justin said, how do we think about emerging technologies, those that are really ready for an IRP today? We're looking at those kind of generator replacement opportunities. So like Justin said, the Quay unit and Tucumcari, can we consider fuel cells? Can we consider long duration energy storage as opportunities as replacements when we model? We also talked about potentially some of our gas units in Cunningham, similarly looking at potentially fuel cells as newer technologies that we think could be competitive now. And then when you start to think about all the other technologies, I think this is the question that we kind of are grappling with and would love feedback from you all on is, there's a lot of advanced generation and storage technologies that are not those specific ones we already listed, that we can see as near-term opportunities, but there's potential significant value to the system. We're talking about clean firm baseload power that could be really cheap in the future. But what do we do today? What should we be doing? So to kind of go through the challenges of why we aren't including them in an IRP today, or why they're not getting selected in our RFPs today, for a variety of reasons, is the costs are high, right? These are first of a kind technologies. By definition, those will be the most expensive. So how might we procure higher cost resources while minimizing impacts to the customers if we do want to move sooner on these technologies? How do we do that responsibly? Should we be doing that? There is long-term performance. Well, there's a lot of data out there to say that that is likely to be true, but we haven't seen a lot of these units run for the 20, 30 years that they're intended. So how do we balance that as we think about our job to provide a reliable grid? Is there a way to right-size those projects? Some of these technologies, like nuclear, take a very long time to develop. So how do we think about that in a resource process that is a constrained timeline? So is there a way for us to think through and procure those long lead item technologies? And then last, this is not a problem that's unique to emerging technologies, but it's one that unique technologies really struggle with, is there's long interconnection queues in SPP. Right? Not unique, but how do we think through that? And is there a mechanism for us to think about small scale opportunities for technologies that can allow us to get access and experience with these technologies sooner? So I tried to go quickly to keep us on time, but I know there's a lot of information, so happy to take questions and talk through anything you all would like.
Yeah, Taylor, that's great. Thanks. While we're waiting for people to raise their hands on Zoom, would you remind our participants what's included in the long duration energy storage bucket?
Yeah, so for us, it's any technologies that are 10 hours to 100 hours. So that could be mechanical storage opportunities, that could be electrochemical storage technologies, that could be thermal technologies. So agnostic to the technology design or approach is really about that 10 to 100 hours, is typically how we think about it from the advanced long duration energy storage world.
Great. Thank you. Questions for Taylor? Let's begin on the Zoom participants. Anyone have questions about technology options? I see Amanda, please go ahead.
The long duration energy storage, obviously, that's a pretty wide bucket of technologies that may look a little type of different. I was just wondering how you are thinking about how you might model it in the context of an IRP. Is it and how the model might select something between a 10 and a 100-hour pump storage versus, iron air battery that might have different kind of operating parameters.
Yeah, so we're working closely with Justin's team on figuring out what are the appropriate generics within that range, exactly to your point. So I think right now we have, I want to say 10-hour, 16-hour, 24-hour, and 100-hour generic ones that we're kind of figuring out what we want to do. But to your point, right, even at 100-hour, those are different technologies. So we're trying to figure out what is that right balance of being realistic, but also not just modeling all the different companies that are out there.
Yeah, just to expand a little bit, I think that this really lends itself to the conversation on what folks want to see. All of these different types of long duration storage technologies, they have different levels of maturity. They also have different characteristics such as return efficiencies. Basically for every megawatt that you put into it or megawatt hour that you put into it, how many megawatt hours you get out of it. So there's lots of thoughts on that, and we'd love to have a conversation in the office hours, specifically about which of these technology types do folks feel is most most desired to be modeling right now. So there are literally thousands of permutations on all these different modeling scenarios, and it really does help us to make sure that we're aligned with the stakeholders to get some feedback on what they think are the most valuable things for us to model and understanding right now.
Great, thank you. Austin, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks. I've been trying to think about how to formulate this question in my head a little bit, but
Austin, I'm sorry, remind people of your organization again, please.
Yeah, Austin Rushoff. I'm an attorney with the New Mexico Large Customer Group. I guess one thing I'm trying to weigh in my head is the timeline of new technologies and how that fits in with New Mexico policy standards. We're right now, SPS is having to plan to how to meet the RPS and zero carbon things in 2045, when it sounds like some of the best solutions to meet those might not be available until, 2040. So I guess the question is the policy limitations sort of limiting how SPS can plan because you're having to plan for those 2045 targets, but you don't currently have access to technologies that might help you meet those. So are we over investing in things now that may in a decade be sort of no longer the best options?
So this is Justin Gable. I'll take that question if we jump in more. I think that when we talk about IRP, that is something that we look at as, this technology type. We're getting input from this emerging tech information that Taylor's providing us and saying, okay, we don't need to be planning to bring on 1,000 megawatts of long duration storage next year. Like, when does it make sense? When are these technologies maturing? And we're utilizing information that we're gathering it from, like, the last RFI, request for information that we had in the last IRP, that's currently still open, and our best guess about the technology types maturity to be able to plan exactly when they're available for selection in the model. So we are not necessarily just saying, like, bring those technologies on today and, oh, we didn't get that bid in, we can't do anything with that. So we're trying to make our best effort to make sure that we're aligning the model inputs to the expectations of the maturity of these different types of emerging tech. I would also say that, like, when we're solutioning near-term needs, the most important need is the near-term needs. So if we're making a selection of resources today, it's because we need to connect customers today. And we can't necessarily wait to connect the customers in 10 years when the technology is matured to a point. We have to still be able to service customers today.
I think the only thing I would
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's just maybe a question for your question is, I think the question that we are grappling with is there a prudent way to try to accelerate some of those timelines by adopting at small scales or whatever it is? Knowing that it's still a long timeline, but that we can get experience and access to these technologies early. Could we, should we, all of those things?
Yes.
I guess obviously maybe not a question for the SPS folks, which is generally is the other question whether the policy requirements that you're having to meet, are they realistic? And, should there be a little more synergy between the policy side and what's actually available to meet those policy goals, I think is, not something I'd expect Justin you to be able to answer, but interesting questions to consider.
I'd like to weigh in on that. This is Mike D'Antoni with Xcel Energy. The ETA has a situation where it's goes from a renewable requirement in 2040 to a clean zero carbon requirement, right? It makes that switch in that 5-year period. And I think that hinders potentially some technologies. We would like to see the ETA modified such that it gets rid of the interim renewable requirements. It just makes it a clean energy requirement or zero carbon requirement. And that way, the utilities are not hamstrung by actually filling that bucket with renewables when renewables may not be the cheapest zero carbon resource. You may have carbon capture. There may be some technologies that come out that are more cost effective. So I think from a policy perspective, changing that to a more generic zero carbon goal throughout those years is probably beneficial. Could be beneficial.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful because I think there's questions we should be asking about, is there ways we can make the ETA more flexible to still meet the targets, but, in a world where we're planning for 2045 right now and having to make investments right now, I don't know. It's difficult. And I think a bigger policy discussion would be welcomed from me, and working with SPS on that would be very helpful.
Yeah, it's really challenging, right? The utility is required to model to the current law, but
Right.
plan for 20 years, right? So it's, Jared, did you want to respond?
Margie, this is Orland with the PRC. I'd like to add a comment here. I think as our utilities are thinking about energy and storage, it's important to mitigate risk. And if I asked SPS a yes or no question, are you mitigating risk? They'd say yes. And so, my comment here is to, our national labs make and break a lot of this technology, generation and storage technology, but we need to be careful with, adopting best systems that are not proven. And so, our utilities, I think, have somewhat of a second adopter methodology, such that we're not absorbing all the risk of trying out new technologies. So I just wanted to add that comment.
And James Hall has a question as well.
Yeah, hi, this is James and Survivor again. Hey, I just wanted to chat about this the slide that talks about the criteria of CCS and readiness. Because I mean, in the public domain now, you can see that Google have got a plant in Illinois, which is a natural gas plant. They're going through the engineering design. It's going to have CCS attached to it, and so probably too much detail to get into here. But we'd be happy to help with a conversation on the cost maturity of CCS. I mean, you have CCS being ready in the 2040s, right, which is 20 years from now. And I think there's definitely some less pessimistic evaluations of the readiness of that technology, right? I think is a fair statement. And the cost maturity, well, that's a function of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If you have to have time matching, and you're a data center and you've got shareholder pressures to get to net zero, then on a voluntary tariff basis, perhaps it is competitive, right, compared to some other options. Maybe not for generic rate base and generic decarbonisation of big systems, but I think the cost maturity question is interesting. The policy maturity with the 45Q, $85 a ton has certainly gone a long way to help excitement about CCS. And so, as I say, happy to maybe in office hours or in any other time we'll talk in more detail about where we are CCS wise, because you could be building natural gas plants now that could be CCS ready in terms of being situated correctly for water, for the other parameters that you need to think about, and then you can start adding on CCS units later down the road. So it's not an either or.
Taylor, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hey Margie, Sam Eisenberg, outside counsel for SPS. Just one more comment to sort of wrap a few of those comments together, and going back to what Carrie said earlier about how we walked through the different model scenarios. To Austin's point, I think one way that we are trying to grapple with how do you characterize what the policy, alignment or misalignment with what's available on different timeframes is to look at that modeling tree and then look at the deltas between different scenarios. So when we walk through that modeling tree, we're not just going to give like raw output. We'll be able to show like, here's the islanded versus non-islanded based looks. What are the cost deltas? What are the different resources being selected? How does that look if you try to split up the system? And looking at those deltas is one way to sort of, I think about how the reality of what we can bring online or what we might be able to bring online in some of these advanced tech scenarios, aligns with that policy. And I don't think we have conclusions until we see the model. But that's one way to look at it. So I think just to go back to Jared's point, to the extent that you want to see a different scenario that takes additional tech generics, something like that, different timing assumptions of what we have, that's helpful because that will give an additional look as to how these different scenarios may be able to meet REA requirements and at what cost.
Great. Thank you, Sam. I wondered if Taylor wanted to comment more about the ratings of carbon capture in the that James had asked about. Taylor, would you like to respond to how those cost maturity and policy maturity ratings, any comment you wanted to make about in response to James's question?
For sure. One, would love to talk about it in office hours. That sounds great. Second, the way we did the cost maturity for all these technologies was we took as many third-party publicly available reports as we could find on for carbon capture was point source on combined cycles. And we said, what is that cost that we're seeing? So we looked at, I think, NREL, Wood Mackenzie, I think IEA, I'm sure had something, and probably a couple other resources. We looked at that and then we said, at what point does it hit certain thresholds? At what point does the cost come $100 below $100 per megawatt hour? What point does it come below $75 per megawatt hour? And that's how we ranked it. But to your point, the technology is mature. They are getting built today. Data centers are paying for them. We've been having a lot of conversations around fuel cells plus carbon capture, which really changed the equation on cost. So fully recognize that this is maybe oversimplified to your points, but yes, there are some things that we think are much more cost effective. And then the policy side has just been more around the Energy Transition Act and the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And that, my understanding, right, is that carbon capture is not eligible for a renewable portfolio standard, and it's a little bit unclear on the Energy Transition Act. So
the last 20%, right? Renewables 80% and then carbon free.
So that goes back to Mike D'Antonio's comment, is that at 80%, that's a REC requirement. That's a forward push towards renewables, and then it converts to a carbon zero. So there's that. It's not an incremental 20% that you're trying to solve. It's completely a different paradigm. It's not necessarily the same problem statement anymore from 2040 to 2045.
That's great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think if people have further questions or topics on this, please go ahead and save them for consideration for office hour. We do have one more presentation from SPP on from SPS regarding membership benefits in the SPP. So Jared, maybe we'll switch to you now for that last piece. And then, of course, if we have additional time for questions before we wrap up, we'll accommodate those. But back to you, Jared.
Thank you, Margie. We're just swapping seats in front of the microphone here in the room. Hopefully you can hear me. I guess it's, I don't even know, good morning, good afternoon by now. Jared Cooley, strategic planning for SPS, here again to speak about a little bit some of the conversations that have come up in prior meetings around the Southwest Power Pool. Full disclosure, I spent a significant amount of my time attending SPP meetings, engaging with SPP staff and SPP stakeholders. I know there's a number of individuals within this room as well as online that attend Southwest Power Pool meetings, either from a listening stance or are now members of the Southwest Power Pool, because of the impact that the Southwest Power Pool plays in our ability as a utility to build transmission, to build generation, and serve customers. And so I wanted to take a little bit of the opportunity today to hit on a couple items. As been alluded to previously, and I think even earlier today, there is a rule, or not a rule, but there is an agreement that we will bring back an analysis on the benefits and the value of being part of the Southwest Power Pool that was identified in a prior case. And that stipulation, when we look to join the Southwest Power Pool as a full member, and I will be bringing some of that information back in 2028. So it's something that we take very seriously. It's something we dig into, but we haven't done all the analysis yet. So the opportunity today is to talk a little bit around how SPP characterizes some of their benefits to members, and want to walk through some of that this afternoon. So kind of really the biggest impact or value of the Southwest Power Pool, if you ever look at their materials, and they have posted materials, member value statement is a document that the Southwest Power Pool produces annually. They also, I can't remember if they still produce it, a value of transmission document as well. They highlight, obviously, the benefits, and that's their job as the Southwest Power Pool to say, why are we great? why should everybody be a member of us from the utilities perspective? There's also value of membership to stakeholders who aren't load responsible entities because they can possibly inform or push policies. But as a utility, there are significant monetary benefits associated with being a member. And one of the key ones is the integrated marketplace. If you look at how the Southwest Power Pool packages together their value and why they should exist, the market is one of their top selling points. This is also why SPP has been advocating for expansion into the West, as well as standing up Markets Plus, is the idea that by bringing together lots of generation facilities together and creating a marketplace, in this case, a day ahead market, in a real-time market, you're able to most cost effectively get that generation to serve customers. And so that is one of the biggest impacts from an SPP, from a monetary standpoint of impacting customers. Also reserve sharing. Now, I know we spend a lot of time, and we probably will spend a lot of time in the future talking about the increases to plan and reserve margins. But at the same time, though, there's value with having neighbors, and that being able to count on their reserves and our reserves effectively allows us to both decrease the amount of reserves we need to carry. And so those are ongoing discussions. And again, that's what is part of those annual studies that the Southwest Power Pool runs for the loss of load expectation studies. And how does that impact the ultimate plan and reserve margin values that get assigned? Reliability coordination, the RC, when I talked about before, this is one of those benefits that SPP has, that if we didn't have the Southwest Power Pool, we would then have to bring back in-house and perform a lot of this analysis. Outage coordination, congestion management, coordination with neighboring utilities. These are things that Southwest Power Pool does within all their tools and operators that honestly help hopefully drive a more reliable bulk electric system. Excellent. Talk about the plan and reserve margin. System-wide transmission planning studies. You know, for those of us that live in the modeling world, whether it's transmission or resource adequacy, having more inputs and having a wider area allows significant opportunities within the analysis to find benefits. And so we see that as well with the transmission planning studies. By collectively gathering the information across the entire region while being able to leverage your neighbor's transmission facilities, you're able to optimize transmission solutions. Now, we've also talked about this in the past with SPS, is we're very much on this little peninsula on the bottom of the system. And so, you know, we don't get sometimes to do as much overlap as some of the more integrated utilities, but we do get to plan together. We get to set consistent analysis, model targets, futures for economic studies with our neighbors. And so then we're being consistent with what everybody else is performing. And then when the transmission projects are identified, there's a cost allocation factor associated with those. That is actually fairly unique to SPP, that the fact that it goes all the way down to 115 kV. When we look at MISO, for example, they really only cost allocate at 300 and above kV, and that's only for their special studies. A lot of those other costs are actually assigned directly to the area for annual studies. And so those are some of the pros and cons on how transmission planning studies are done. And then just, you know, engineering training services, tariffs, and then the integration of wind and renewable resources. When we go back a decade ago and we look at what could we have integrated for renewables, it is significant, and this is the same for every utility, but it is significantly less than where we're even at today and where we expect ourselves to be in another 5 to 10 years. And a lot of that integration of renewable resources is the ability to tie in with a greater system, to leverage those other resources on the system, to minimize curtailments within our own footprint because there's load elsewhere, and then counting on rotating mass from other utilities. And so being able to be effectively part of a wider area allows us to integrate more renewables. So, as I alluded to, the Southwest Power Pool produces what is called a member value statement annually. And so they just recently produced the 2025 MVS members value statement. Within there, they kind of break it out into a number of different categories that they identify as financial values. Operations reliability, again, that's the core function of us as a utility. That is the core goal of Southwest Power Pool. Keep the lights on. With any utility or RTO, the more outages you have, the less credibility you have, and the more questions you get about your ability to maintain a safe and reliable system. So obviously that's a big crux of the value of SPP, and they put $1 to that. Then there's the markets, as I said, that is really probably one of the biggest financial benefits that SPP touts is the value back to customers is the market. Then transmission, as I said, robust transmission build out, wind integration, and the reserve margin discussions. And then there's professional services. As I said, these are the type of things about training and about running the reliability coordinator and having more engineering staff to run the analysis, both in real-time planning as well as long-term planning. Justin Gable's department would need to be much larger if we had to run our own ELCC analysis and set our own PRM values on an annual basis. So, it's those type of things is that there's that trade-off of somebody else doing that for 115 members. Again, not everybody's a utility in SPP, but let's just say there's 60 load responsible entities in the region. You're counting on one staff to perform a lot of that analysis versus everybody having their own individual teams, creating their own individual methodologies and stuff that then can result in actually conflict between neighbors. This is how the member value statement has evolved over the years. SPP has been publishing this since 2014. I'm not sure if it goes back further, but this is the table that they provided in their materials. And so you can see how they show that there's some ups and downs along the way, but the trend has historically gone up over time. And again, looking at 2025, the dark blue or black is operations. The very large one is the markets. As I said, that's where SPP sees a significant amount of their value to customers. And we see that same value as well. And then the transmission generation planning with the professional services being a low one, but it's still a value nonetheless. And you can see that it's whether you agree with the actual numbers and the methodology, broadly, you can see that over time and as more resources integrated, as more load comes online, we've been seeing the value, or SPP has been publishing that their value continues to increase over time. Won't get into all the details on this slide, but this is a worksheet or workbook that SPP has within their MVS, members value statement document, and you're able to plug in your own numbers and do your own calculations in here. And again, it's broke out. This one has benefits related to load share, reserve sharing benefits, services, unique benefits that we may have, and then unique costs, which is tied to really like admin fees, how much it costs us as a utility to pay SPP to be a member. And again, that's different if you're a load responsible entity versus if you are more of an advocate or a customer. You just pay a membership fee versus we pay more since we bring load to the table and we have to pay our load ratio shares. But there's this very robust calculation, and we took a shot at populating the materials, and at the end, using SPP's methodology, we're showing over $500 million of benefit. And so again, this is just a snapshot of showing a way in which SPP articulates how they show their value and how they think that members should be reflecting it. Wanted to bring that forward. Again, this is just something we're able to put together fairly quickly to kind of reflect the value of SPP, the benefits of SPP to customers, tied to really some of those discussions with our own internal, more robust analysis performed closer to that 2028 filing. So just, I'll just open up here. Any questions on SPP and the benefits and values that we see with them?
Great. Thanks, Jared. Let's start first with folks on the Zoom, in the Zoom room. We still have about 28 people there. So let's open it up to questions about SPP membership. Folks on Zoom room, let's give them a minute to raise hands, and then we'll go to the room there in Albuquerque. I don't see any on Zoom. So are there questions in the room? Please remember to state your name and organization.
As people are thinking of any questions they want to bring up here, I'll just make a plug for Southwest Power Pool. Next week, they'll actually be having their board of directors meeting here in Albuquerque, Monday and Tuesday next week. And so Monday will be their regional state committee, which is comprised of a commissioner from every state. There's actually now 17 commissioners because the SPP has expanded into the West and added a few more states. So those will all be here. They'll be doing meetings and voting on different policies on Monday afternoon. And then on Tuesday is actually when the board of directors will actually meet and vote on a number of policies as well. They'll be here in Albuquerque. So that information, if anybody's interested in attending, whether virtually or in person, can be found on the Southwest Power Pool website.
Great. Any other questions in the room?
I don't think so, Margie.
None in the room. Margie, I guess, do we have a few minutes to circle back to a question from earlier? Before we turn it back to GridWorks to close this out?
Yeah, just a moment, Jared. Let me see if Kathy, you see anything in chat or on the Zoom room that we need to come to questions before we we have about another 10 minutes, Jared, but let's check in. Kathy, anything you're seeing?
I do not. Nope, looks clear.
Okay. Yes. Jared, back to you for another, and maybe we should first open up if people have questions on anything from today, and then Jared, have you pose the question that's on your mind. So let's see if anybody else has a question of anything. I don't see any hands raised. So yeah, Jared, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it's not a question from me, but it's a question here in the room. So it's part of this general Q&A now that we're entered into. So Ms. Hatley.
Thank you for the opportunity. Carrie Hatley with ConocoPhillips. I just had a quick question on Justin and Taylor's presentation earlier about advanced tech. If we could circle back quickly, specifically about slide 50. In the last CCN proceeding, there was a lot of conversation about the RFPs potentially being like narrowing some of the generation that could bid in because of the long interconnection queues, and also like the RFPs the lead time wasn't long enough for them. And so first of all, just a general thumbs up for the concept of running a long lead time RFP to kind of capture some of this advanced tech that might potentially get to come in. And then also I just wanted to spend a little bit more time and ask just wonder what you're thinking about when you say creative interconnection opportunities and consider leveraging the distribution grid. That's a really intriguing option for me, to lots of us for lots of reasons. The long interconnections queues being one, and the expensive transmission costs being another. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Yes, so there's a lot of questions there, so let me make sure I answer all of them. But so we hoped that this IRP, specifically some of those sensitivities that I proposed around like Quinn County specifically, I think that spot is uniquely able to capture both an opportunity to see what long duration storage or a different fuel cell technology could be developed at that location. And because it would be replacement, it would be going through a replacement study and not be part of the DICES or what they're going to go through. They're going to go to a CPP process, but that would avoid some transmission network upgrade costs by looking at that specific site. So we're talking about maybe a specific RFP for that location once we see what the IRP results are and the different opportunities there. So surplus is always a potential opportunity to help avoid or mitigate transmission network upgrade costs. replacement. Specifically, when I think about long-term RFPs or things that may result from this, emerging tech's best option, in my mind, is to utilize existing interconnections. Like you're already going with the resource type that is potentially challenged on economics in the near term. So expanding that horizon and then also coupling it with the replacement strategy, you avoid transmission network upgrade costs. So I think that for emerging tech specifically, if that's something that we want to see as a help to solution out New Mexico specific requirements, that's its best path forward in my mind. So I do think though that when you introduce the idea of an RFP structure or something that's further out in time, you introduce less accuracy into financial predictions. When you go out that far in time, and if it's not part of it ultimately would have to be part of a DICES study or a CPP study. Those costs are going to have to be unknown. In fact, in the 25 RFP, this is one of the requirements we altered from last RFP to this RFP was the requirement for the phase 2 in the DICES study. And we highlighted that allowing phase 1 DICES numbers to come in introduces an unknown cost to transmission network upgrade costs. What we're seeing is that that's a significant impact right now. The 24 DICES has some substantial network upgrade costs associated with that. So that is some of the trade-off with going out and doing a much longer term resource acquisition. So did I get all of it? I don't think I did.
No, you did. That was a really good answer, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, the other thing is, a lot of these ideas and questions are inspired by what other utilities are doing to become comfortable with new technologies, right? So to the point that was made before, we don't need to be first, nor do we necessarily want to be first, but how do we become ready to be second, third, 10th in an expedient time? And so some different utilities are looking at doing 10 megawatt demonstrations for 5 years or 10 years that are on retired plants or at their distribution systems. So they get experience with that technology. They feel very comfortable. It's a small scale. It's not that much of a cost to the customer. If it goes down, it's not that big on the overall system, but you get comfortable with it, then you can go to 50, you can go to 100. You can be very expedient in accelerating the adoption of these technologies. So I think those are all the kind of thought that I was trying to put behind this and not lead you all to a specific answer, but maybe that helps explain some of the distribution parts too.
Yeah, it does.
To add to that, because I think it's a really good point, is that there are lots of different ways to get this done. The IRP rules specifically state least cost solution to meet customer needs. So there is some incongruency between developing projects with emerging tech and potentially being an incremental cost as compared to the least cost solution. So it's something to be thinking about, when we're talking conversations we were having about policy discussions, things like that, ETA in general, it's something that we're thinking about.
I have a follow-up to that. Sorry, Mike, you talking with Excel Energy. So, and I understand we do have a evergreen RFI process. How is that incorporated into the IRP, if at all? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So can you just repeat the question just in case those online couldn't hear?
Yeah, so the question is, we have an evergreen RFI. How does that integrate into the IRP process, if at all? So my job is to meet with new technologies. I talk to a handful a week, at least. I talk to them all the time. So typically what we do is we have an intro meeting with them and then we ask them to fill out the RFI. The data in the RFI is pretty well aligned to a light touch version of what they would need to submit into a real bid. So it both allows us to really vet these technologies in a more realistic way, not as a VC or venture capital, and it allows us to collect some data on their estimated costs. Because these are not so site specific or anything like that, we do assume that there's a good amount of error as you would in any kind of generic gas or solar project that doesn't have a specific site. So then what we do is we take third-party publicly available data around cost estimates over time for these new technologies. So we talked about carbon capture, looking at what NREL said or NLR says, or what IEA says. We'll look at all those third-party reports, and then we'll say, okay, but every developer is telling us that they're actually sitting at the higher range of this cost profile, or their operations are more aggressive than what's being shown in the public domain. So we'll just tweak the data slightly more towards them. So we're not saying or just one-to-one that company's data. We're trying to take what's publicly out there and try to align it as best as we can with current up-to-date market information from the RFI.
Great. Good question, Mike, and thanks, Taylor, for the description.
Okay.
Anything pressing?
Yes, I got
one more from here in the room.
I've got a question, Orland, with the PRC. This is a difficult question to answer, but the CAISO has identified some significant savings in their DR programs. However, what those are demand response programs. And so I'd like to know, as I look at the low duration curve, if there's a percentage, what percentage contribution is the current DR program, in New Mexico contributing to that low duration curve? And then, how does SPS reconcile the risk of shifting a DR program over to its customers? So, I think that's important because you've got performance metrics that you need to abide by. And that's something that I can't wrap my brain around right now.
That is a big question. And I'd love to talk more about it. But in general, I have some thoughts and comments.
1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. And demand response is kind of going through some review at Southwest Power Pool. And relating it to understanding, is this an accredited resource? Is this a load modifying resource? They're kind of trying to go to a couple of different paradigm shifts on the RA workbook submittals. One of those being a post-season analysis. So you're not going to be judged based upon your capacity position on forecast values and on actuals. So if you're utilizing demand response in an actual scenario, it's not projected amount of demand response. It's what demand response is actually used to mitigate your peak. So in a situation like that, from where we're at right now, we can forecast the expectation of demand response and not necessarily have to utilize it. In the future, that goes away. And so making sure that you're not overvaluing demand response becomes very critical, because if you are assuming too much and then it does not perform in the market, you could be finding yourself in a capacity short position and ultimately be subject to deficiency payments. There are other things too, specifically about the flatness of our low duration curve and its ability to be able to mitigate that peak. Currently, what we project is that our system can handle about 350 megawatts of demand response. Does that necessarily mean that we have 350 megawatts of customers signed up for that? No, because it does require customer participation. Those programs can be made available and not necessarily be participated in. So just a couple of things, but I would love to have more conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I think, for any stakeholders who are listening in and aren't kind of understanding what you just said is, shifting over the risk to customers becomes an issue with, customers have a right to opt out. And what we discovered in Winter Storm Uri is that they opt out at the worst times. If you think about this kind of intuitively, when a lightning storm goes off and your power goes out, what do you do when your power comes back on? You charge all your devices at once. And that's exactly what happened in Winter Storm Uri and why we ran into an emergency. And so, or not us, but Texas, but we helped with that emergency. But so thank you for that answer. I just wanted to add that little comment for our stakeholders. Thank you.
Sure.
And I don't know if you can share, but how many of your customers have signed up for demand, or what percentage, or quantity, or?
No way.
Just curious how much response that's gotten, maybe.
I'm sorry,
Joseph, or maybe. Maybe.
Let's hold that question for further conversation. I think that's an interesting question, Carrie. We want to honor everybody's time for today, and so we'd like to close to be sure people understand what's happening next. Great conversation and questions, a lot more to discuss. And so what we'd like for everyone to do, both on Zoom and in the room in Albuquerque, is to write down where you have more questions, where you want to learn more. Either put those into the chat if you're on Zoom, or if you're in the room in Albuquerque, you can either email those to us by the end of today to Deb Shields and Linda Hudgens, or you can drop Linda a note while you're in the room and she can just take note of them today. But we're actually allowing until May 7th at 5 o'clock if you want to digest some of the materials from today and send us in questions or topics you would like to be considered for an office hour session on May 12th. It will begin at 1:30. Depending on the number of topics, we don't know the end time for that. We're anticipating that it will last for sure more than an hour, but it could be as much as 2.5 hours for various topics in an office hour. We will put together an agenda and send that out a few days prior, but please let us know what topics you want to dig into in more detail, and we'll prioritize those based on the number of stakeholders who mention that topic. If we need additional office hours, or we will do that, or we will address those topics that can't be accommodated on May 12th at the next workshop. And that brings me to the next slide, which describes where you can get more information. Of course, a workshop summary, this recording, and all the materials are available on the GridWorks website. Also, SPS has sent to us, and they're posted on the website, the data access request forms and instructions. So if you are someone who would like to get into more detail on looking at modeling data, please consider reviewing those forms and turning those into SPS to request access through a shared system called iManage. So please look for that under workshop number 3. We've already mentioned the office hour on the 12th of May, starting at 1:30, the agenda to be announced. And then topics we don't get to then, of course, we'll factor into the agenda at our next workshop on May the 20th from 9 a.m. to noon Mountain Daylight Time via Zoom. And we'll begin to understand any model results to date that the utility has to share with us then. So with that, questions can be sent to Deb Shields and Linda Hudgens. Your topics at this point, if you have a few minutes as we're closing to put in ideas and topics you'd like to be considered for the next office hour, please do so. The sooner we get input, the sooner we can put together an agenda and get that back out to folks. And with that, I would like to turn the podium back to Jared or Linda. If you would like to make any closing remarks for today, please go ahead. And we really appreciate everybody's participation today. So Jared and Linda, over to you.
Thank you, Margie and team, for facilitating this today. I'll just continue to make the plea there of please review the materials that we went over today. Please submit questions. Please submit suggestions to Deb and to Linda so we can factor those in as we move forward. Please submit questions so we can continue to engage. The whole purpose of the IRP is to have a robust stakeholder engagement, to answer questions, to get thoughts, to get concerns, and figure out the right path forward for our IRP filing later this year. And so, again, appreciate everybody's attendance today. Appreciate the question and engagement. And we look forward to the office hours and the meeting in late May. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. You all take care, and we will be in touch. Thank you to those who sent in their contact information. If you're new to our workshops, we'll add you to the distribution list and keep you informed. So thank you so much, and safe travels to those of you who are back on the road. Thank you.